Let me acknowledge the Minister and thank you very much for convening us today in this very important time as we close Mandela Month. And we are hoping that we close Mandela Month on a great note of constitutionalism. How constitutional beings are we? Can we be better beings who are constitutional? Let me also acknowledge the DG, Dr. Mashabane. Thank you very much, Dr. Mashabane, for always coming up with these kind of things that we need to just get the nation in dialogue. To my fellow panelists, Metulima Donzela in her absence, Lindio Madzibuko before she joins, Prof. Muhale, Fasia Hassan, our MPL from Gauteng, and of course the keynote address will come from Memokoro, Justice Mokoro. Thank you so much for joining us and for making the time. I need to also acknowledge all the people who have joined us and to apologize for the late start. We promised that we will finish on time at 12:15 as promised, just so that we don't inconvenience you with the late start. I think I need to just maybe plant a seed, a provocation if you like. That our argument as the Nelson Mandela Foundation is that the best articulation of Madiba's dream for South Africa is the Constitution, but that the Constitution must be real for the discarded, those who always feel that they are outside, those who feel that they are the wretched of the earth. For as long as the Constitution is not a lived reality for the vast majority of those who live in South Africa, A, we cannot rest. And secondly, the rule of law will always be fragile and vulnerable. And we've seen that vulnerability in recent weeks. And if there's anything that we can do around that vulnerability, none of us are secure. Even if we live in high walls, none of us are secure. We then have to resort to using guns in order to keep the majority out. And that's again showing that none of us are secure. We must try and give all of us a chance to just have an opportunity to be better as South Africans. And I think that's the key that I'd like to put forward to all of us today. Poverty and inequality, unemployment, which is hitting the youth particularly, will always be something that we need to deal with. Race and identity. We cannot deny that racism is still a major issue in terms of South African politics and South African life. And I think we need to then be asking ourselves, how constitutional are we when we are not creating an environment that makes all of us feel that we belong? And that sense of belonging is what we need to be testing today. And with those words, I want to welcome each one of you and ask that we all participate fully so that each one of us can then feel that this webinar is not just a talk shop. It's actually following other webinars that have been organized and will be organized in future. Just last week, we were hosted by the Human Rights Commission, which were looking at these kind of issues that we're dealing with today. This morning, I received a copy of Sizwe Mpofu Welsh's book, The New Apartheid. And I think this is the kind of a book that we should all be trying to then understand. Is apartheid dead? And if it's not, how do we make sure that we kill apartheid in all the strata of society that's there? So I'm looking forward to reading this book, and I encourage all of us to maybe look into this book so that we then can see how do we eliminate this into it in terms of South African psyche and South African systems of thinking and working. So let me start off with Memokoro, someone that needs no introduction. She's a former constitutional court judge, someone who I have walked many walks with. I've worked with her in many different places. Whenever there was a crisis in Gauteng, she would be the first person that the Premier will call and she would lead the process that we would then be dealing with. So I need not introduce her too much. And then before she comes in, I want to ask our host for today, someone who thought it was important for us to actually have this dialogue, Minister Ronald Lamola. And Dr. Lamola, none of us will forget you for the many days that you'd spend outside saying we need to stop the looting. And now we continue to have other forms of looting. And we are hoping that you bring that kind of voice that says, what I worked for previously, I continue to work hard for today.
Thank you, Program Director Dade Slaughter, and all the participants in the webinar. Advocate Mashavane, the Director General of the Department of Justice and Constitutional Development, Ms. Fastia Hassan, a member of the Gauteng Provincial Legislature, Ms. Lindwe Mazibugo, Founder and Chief Executive Officer of the Apolitical Academy, and the former leader of the opposition party in South Africa in the National Assembly, Professor Bonang Mohal, Chancellor of the University of the Free State, and the former Chief Executive Officer of Business Leadership South Africa, Professor Tulima Donsela, the Law Trust Chair in the Social Justice and Law Professor at the University of Stellenbosch and former Public Protector of the Republic of South Africa, Mr. John Jeffrey, our Deputy Minister for the Department of Justice and Constitutional Development, retired Justice of the Constitutional Court, Mayor Yvonne Mokgoro, and I must state that she was my chairperson of council at the university when I was the president of the SRC. I'm honored to have her here as one of our guest speakers. I would like to preface my address of welcome to all of you by citing the first section of our Constitution, Section 1AC of the Republic of South Africa, which states as follows, that South Africa is one, a sovereign democratic state founded on the following values: human dignity, the achievement of equality and the advancement of human rights and freedoms, non-racialism and non-sexism, supremacy of the Constitution and the rule of law. In this month of July, these values were put to the test in a way that we have never seen before. As Professor Mohale reminds us in his book, Live as You Rise, values are like lighthouse. A lighthouse does not move. You will move your juggernaut or your old tanker to the correct course according to the lighthouse. Likewise, values are lighthouse by in difficult situations. Close quote. This question that arises is whether we have been able to live up to the values as espoused in Section 1 of our Constitution and the Nelson Mandela values in the past 25 years that he taught us. In essence, we must have the determination to build a just society, one which learns from its past and listens to all its voices. The past 25 years have taught us that we need a social compact between civil society, private sector, and government to build a just society. Recent activities reminded us of our past in many ways. It also showed us how socio-economic challenges faced by our people, poverty, inequality, unemployment, can be utilized as a weapon to threaten the values upon which we have built our democratic country. The challenges that have been brought about by the COVID-19 pandemic further exacerbates the situation. In some ways, we not only heard all the voices, but also the screams of inequality, particularly of racial nature, which persists in a post-apartheid South Africa. As Deputy Judge President Mujapile pointed in the matter of the Nelson Mandela Foundation versus AfriForum, he said, and I quote, "One of the specific goals for the current constitution is to redress the legacy of race-based inequalities, which was characterized by the denial of dignity to the Black South Africans," close quote. This is in essence the rule of law. However, there also can be no denying that recent events in our young democracy have brought to the fore questions about whether there is an erosion of respect for the rule of law and constitutionalism in our country. And so, one must ask whether the assertion of human dignity the achievement of equality and the advancement of human rights and freedoms, non-racialism and non-sexism, supremacy of the Constitution and the rule of law. Is it something that could trigger the unrest we witnessed in the last 2 weeks? It is simply not possible that these values, which bind us as a nation, could be allowed to be undermined to an extent that some could even lead to unrest and divisions and the looting that we have seen. I will also argue further that those who stand diametrically opposed to the socio-economic rights espoused in the Constitution are not different from the architects of the Criminal Act and the undermining of the rule of law we witnessed in the last weeks. The unrest of the past few weeks reminds us violently that Constitution is not just an aspiration, but it must be a lived reality. Without socio-economic inclusion of the majority of South Africans, it is evident that the rule of law is under threat. According to State South Africa, there is significant disparity in poverty levels between population groups in South Africa. In 2015, 9 out of every 10 people in South Africa were Black. Statistics indicate that 64.2% of Black people legally classified as African in our country lived in poverty. But amongst white people, those who live in poverty constitute about 1%. There is a 90% chance that children born into poverty will also end up being poor, which perpetuates the cycle of poverty and undermines social mobility. This is what our governance system must address with urgency. This is what we cannot delay economic freedom any longer. If there is a lesson we should have learned in the past 25 years, is that the gains of freedom must be felt by every South African. We must be honest by not only reflecting on misgovernance, but acting timelessly against it. Failure to address misgovernance can only defer the full implementation of our Constitution. The Zondo Commission is a critical vantage point in that regard. I am of the firm view that all the time when interpreting the Constitution, we must take into account the concept of originalism regarding the interpretation. The concept asserts that all statements in the Constitution must be interpreted based on the original understanding at the time the Constitution was adopted. No doubt that the drafters of the Constitution had in mind to unite South Africans with their diversity, uproot the economic imbalances and all forms of racial discrimination. Economic freedom is a necessity for the rule of law to be entrenched and sustained. Professor Bonang Mohale, I have no doubt that with the assistance of our social partners in the private sector, civil society and academia, we can realize the fruits of the Constitution. The relationship between justice and economic freedom is highly contingent on all our social partners implementing the Constitution. South Africans from all walks of life must become activists to dismantle the legacy of apartheid. Social exclusions cannot be allowed to continue manifesting. These are detrimental towards our constitutional democracy and have the potential to undermine the gains we've made. The recent accelerated pace of our vaccination program is a result of cooperation between the private sector, civil society, and government. We have passed the 7 million mark in our vaccination program. It is an indication of many things we can achieve if this kind of cooperation can be enhanced in all sections of our society. In other words, if we all work together, we can achieve great things as a nation. South Africa's vaccinations program today stands among the best in the world. We are now ranked number 11 in the world vaccination program and still climbing. We have even outranked some of the most developed nations in the world. It is because we put our hands together as a nation to ensure that the vaccination program move with the desired speed that will enable us to return to some form of normality and to reach the much needed herd immunity. We have to learn from the past 25 years. There have been pitfalls and challenges. There have also been successes. We need to build from the successes as we move into the next 25 years. We should not be talking about inequalities in the 50-year anniversary of the Constitution when we moved into the next 25 years, but a nation that has disseminated inequality and a nation that is standing together. It therefore gives me great pleasure to open this very critical dialogue with a rich lineup of incredible South Africans. All of our speakers on this platform have and continue to shape the direction of this great nation in significant ways with their skills and contribution to critical forums in our nation. On behalf of the Department of Justice and Constitutional Development, I would like to extend my gratitude to you for accepting this invitation to this dialogue and offer your profound insights on deepening constitutionalism in our country. No matter what our challenges are, we can never be threatened or disregard our constitution. It is our only hope that binds us together. Welcome to this webinar and all the best to everyone. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lamola. I would like to now bring in the justice or the former justice of the Constitutional Court, Mokoro, to be the next speaker who's going to give us the keynote address. Mokoro. Justice Mokoro.
I think she's muted. You can just let her know that she needs to unmute.
Sia, you might have to do something on your side because even her video is not enabled.
Okay, I've enabled her video, Mr. Hatta.
Okay. Memokoro, if you can hear us, you are muted.
Hello?
Yes, now we can hear you.
Oh, good. Thank you. I lost connection at some stage. But my video is not on, but can I start with
yes, you can
my
go,
address?
you can start.
As long as you can hear me. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Minister, and your team for inviting me to share some thoughts in this webinar. Thanks for inviting me, and thank you also to my co-panelists for giving me an opportunity by accepting the invitation to share these thoughts with you in this webinar. As we all know, the purpose of this webinar is to share ideas on deepening the Constitution. And the idea of deepening the Constitution, to my mind, gives us an opportunity to consciously reflect on the state of constitutionalism in South Africa. And it gives us another opportunity to retrace our steps, I think, and determine how far we have come. But more importantly to me, it grants us another opportunity to critically and sincerely reflect on the strengths and the shortcomings of our own brand of constitutionalism, and when necessary, to determine how to make our constitution more purposefully effective as a tool we had created for ourselves to build a democracy which is based on the promotion, the respect, the protection, and the fulfillment of the basic human rights contained in the Bill of Rights of our Constitution, which in turn is the cornerstone, as we say, of our democracy. Now, the values of equality, freedom, human dignity, the supremacy of the Constitution and the rule of law are integral to the energy or the strength of this tool. That, I think, in essence, is the South African version, or as Silo likes to say sometimes, the South African brand of constitutionalism. Now, ordinarily, constitutions the world over are crafted in an enduring fashion, mostly for purposes of stability. That certainly does not mean that constitutions are sacrosanct and may not be amended when necessary and when it suits particular national needs, or when it suits the changed circumstances at a particular point in time in the life of a nation. A national clamor for constitutional change that must respond to current national needs might therefore not necessarily be out of line. We have, since the dawn of our democracy, been showered with global admiration for a most progressive constitution, which has a deliberately generous and fit for purpose Bill of Rights. Like no other constitution elsewhere, we had the audacity to protect socio-economic rights as justiciable rights, which may be adjudicated before the courts, where the judiciary has the constitutional power of judicial review, and where we unapologetically constitutionalized affirmative action. All three arms of the law, that is Parliament, or the legislature as we sometimes say, the executive or government, and the judiciary or the courts, are constitutionally obligated to promote, protect, and fulfill the rights in the Bill of Rights. And for that reason, colleagues, the legislature has a constitutional duty to pass legislation which advances the rights of people in the context of the constitutional project. The executive, or the government, if you may, is equally obligated to determine and create executive instruments of policy, regulations, programs, projects, and like instruments, implementing those instruments in order to promote, protect, and fulfill the rights in the Bill of Rights. Therefore, Parliament and government need not wait to be brought before the courts to be ordered to fulfill their obligations before they do so. However, should they fail to proactively fulfill their constitutional duties, the courts in South Africa, based on a constitutional complaint or a constitutional challenge, have the power of judicial review and will indeed order compliance with the relevant constitutional imperatives. And the courts have over the years indeed fulfilled that responsibility, and they've done so without fear, without favor, and without prejudice. The Constitution must just therefore be viewed as a tool with which we had intended to break down the walls of the injustices of the past and simultaneously build a democratic and caring society where all would not only be equal before the law, but would also equally enjoy the protection of the rights in the Bill of Rights, including the specific socio-economic rights. When in 1996, we included socio-economic rights in the Bill of Rights as justiciable rights, the resolve and determination to fight against the impact of decades of colonial and apartheid socio-economic injustice was certainly clear. The state must create the necessary instruments to progressively realize, amongst other things, the elimination of abject poverty among the majority of people in South Africa. And that, for me, is an important imperative in the scheme of things constitutional in South Africa. Now, this year, we have reached the 25th anniversary of constitutionalism in South Africa, And as we observe this constitutional milestone and reflect on its efficacy, we would indeed find reasons, more than one, to celebrate. However, we must juxtapose the rights protection in the Constitution with the reality of our experience. In particular, we must reflect on the extent to which the respect, the protection, and fulfillment of the rights in the Bill of Rights and the basic constitutional values of equality, human dignity, and freedom are part of the everyday reality of the majority of people. And we must do so honestly. We must do so openly, with a deliberate purpose of addressing our own post-Constitution injustices and other shortcomings. Although we have long realized that the scars and societal damage of our past are indeed deep and would not be easy to heal, the courage that we have demonstrated, entrenching socio-economic rights as justiciable rights and not as mere policy directives, made us to believe that by now we should have significantly reversed the tide of abject poverty in this country. Instead, we continue to be confronted with an ever-widening wealth gap. 25 years down the line, notwithstanding that we have the world's most progressive tool with which to achieve our democratic ideals of equality, we continue to be known as the world's most unequal society. And Professor Bonang Mohala will tell us that whereas the structure of most societies would be diamond-shaped, with the majority of people constituted by the middle class, reflected across the middle of the diamond. The poor and the wealthy in those societies would be reflected at the bottom and at the top corners of the diamond, respectively. In our country, however, the majority of people constitute the poorest in our society, and they would be reflected across the middle of the diamond shape. A further phenomenon which, although not unique to South Africa, but is in the context of the relevant constitutional rights protection, a serious injustice, is the feminization of poverty. Only this week, Business South Africa gave the statistic that about 17 million people in South Africa rely on social grants. And I would be inclined to think that most of them are women. And in the context of the recent destruction and looting of businesses in the particular areas of the country, joblessness has increased significantly. A further concern is the statistical demonstration of the feminization of poverty, a global phenomenon from which we are not spared. And as we reflect 25 years back, we have and we must address the basis of the continued abject poverty in our country. When we grew up and were nurtured in families which reminded us of the importance of education to overcome apartheid poverty. And I do not think it would be misplaced if those same sentiments are seen to have resonance in the context of South African abject poverty. Another bitter pill to swallow, notwithstanding the constitutional guarantee of the rights to gender equality, human dignity, freedom, and the right to personal integrity. And despite the plethora of protective legislation aimed at protecting women against gender-based violence in South Africa, in 1999, South Africa was said to have the highest incidence of gender-based violence globally, including rape and domestic violence. And in December of 2020, last year, the president declared the scourge a second pandemic that we as a country has to contend with, thus demanding the government's full attention. And although the rape statistics would include men as rape survivors, 90% of survivors are women. And for that reason, colleagues, the call for an end to age-old harmful gender norms and gender stereotyping against women, which tend to justify violence against them, together with the sufficient socio-economic empowerment of women, aspects of gender relations which have been found to be major causes of gender-based violence, is long overdue. And once more, as we reflect and trace our steps from where we come from, where we are and where we are going to, it is important for sectors of society to come together. And finally, we know that it will not, gender-based violence or violence in society may not be altogether eliminated. But it is important, as the president had said last year, to deal with gender-based violence in a way that is focused and that demands the full attention, not only of government, but of society as a whole. It is comforting to note that panelists on this platform will indicate what the role of the various sectors will be in deepening the Constitution or deepening constitutionalism in South Africa. The need to address and pay particular attention to violence against women, where women constitute the majority of people, not only worldwide, but also in this country, where many households are led by women. The necessity to address violence against women in the home and outside of the home is critical if we want to achieve the ideal, caring society that our Constitution envisages. In our Constitution, the rule of law is one of the underlying or basic values of our Constitution. In its most basic form, the rule of law is the notion that no person is above the law, requiring that members of the public and state officials equally account for their actions. The rule of law thus elevates the law above personal and above group interests. It supports the principle that we are all equal before the law and we shall all account for our actions before the courts of law, where the courts must adjudicate independently, without fear, without favor, and without prejudice. The laws are just therefore enforced equally and must be enforced consistently. For that reason, colleagues, the rule of law prevents authoritarianism and the arbitrary use of public authority and public power, and it aims to prevent undue public disorder. In our Constitution, the rule of law, alongside the supremacy of the Constitution, are part of the group of basic constitutional values which reflect the spirit of the Constitution, requiring that, of course, the rule of law, where laws are transparent and understandable, rules and procedures are easily and comfortably followed. However, the rule of law also involves notions of ethical choices that are required to be made at a point in time or a point of decision-making. Based on the capability to distinguish between right and wrong in the context of compelling circumstances which impact on the choices made. But nevertheless, in our Constitution and in our legal system, while incapacity to distinguish between right and wrong, usually associated with mental incapacity, may be a basis for exemption from legal accountability, ignorance of the law is, however, not an excuse for unlawful action, and it excludes any exemption from having to account for unlawfulness. Now, our Constitution is a caring and compassionate Constitution, but justified compassion may, at the least, only mitigate the sanction. It provides no exemption from accountability. In the context of the recent civil unrest and public destruction of crucial business and economic infrastructure, we must find a way in which our public responses to national pertinent issues can be expressed. At this point in time, colleagues, it suffices for me to say, at the very least, it seems, to a large extent, the family value system, and perhaps to a lesser extent, the schooling system certainly have their work cut out for them. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Mama Koro. Sia, can you please enable the videos across the board so that we don't have this problem of the video every time? Thank you very much, Mama Koro. Can we just, as we reflect on the two presentations, just to note that Minister Mokoro and rather Minister Lamola and Judge Mokoro both used the words of how do we build a values-based society, a society that cares about the vulnerable, about the poor. How do we ensure that social bonding and social cohesion become the key things that we as a society observe, that we ensure that our society is one that can ensure that democracy sticks, because it's democracy that cares about those who are vulnerable to poverty and inequality. How can we celebrate, Judge Mokoro asks, the 25th anniversary of the Constitution, when reality of our experience has been one where there's a widening gap of poverty and inequality, where we are known as the most unequal society in the world. And I think these things are things that we should then be worrying about. While waiting for Madonzela, I thought we should then move on to the first panelist, who can then come on board to tell us about the role of civil society in ensuring that we we become that society that we are all thinking about, which is Lindiwe Mazibuko. So good to see you again, my dear sister, after such a long time. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Butselo, and thank you to Justice Mokgoro for that really important keynote intervention, especially with respect to the rights of women under the Constitution. And thank you to the Justice Minister and the Department for inviting me to be a part of this panel on this incredibly auspicious occasion. It's not, of course, happening at a particularly auspicious time in our history as a country. It is tragic to see that we are celebrating 25 years of our Constitution at a time when it feels as though our socio-political and economic fabric is under strain, possibly the worst strain, and at its most fragile moment in our entire democratic history. So I've been tasked with talking about the role of civil society in promoting a social dialogue on the deepening of constitutionalism, the rule of law, and the promotion of respect for the rule of law. I want to start with definitions. I think as South Africans, we often use this term, this catch-all term, civil society, to refer to everything that is not government, that is not business, and that is not labor. And I think we need to start to think about how we segment even our thinking around what civil society constitutes, because it runs the full gamut from religious organizations to, to social groups, to community groups, to nonprofit organizations, to, organizations that do humanitarian work on behalf of the most vulnerable people in our country, organizations that do strategic litigation, using the courts in order to vindicate the constitutional rights of the most marginalized people in our country. But civil society is also ordinary people going about doing leadership where they are. So it includes, school teachers, community workers, nurses, doctors, people who have professions elsewhere, but also turn themselves and their energies to their own communities in order to ensure that people are able to live lives that are both prosperous and dignified. And I think that's just a very, very large group of organizations and individuals to whom we are asking this question: how can we encourage them in their leadership in their own communities to deepen constitutionalism, to deepen respect for the principles of the Constitution and for the rule of law. Before I dive into what civil society can and should do in order to promote constitutionalism in South Africa, I just want to remind those of you who've never heard of or who have forgotten this little anecdote about the late United States Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. In 2012, she attracted a lot of controversy from the Republicans in her own country when she gave an interview with Egyptian television, and she challenged the notion that America's democracy is somehow exceptional throughout the world. She was asked which constitution she would recommend to Egyptian people emerging from the Arab Spring and the revolution as they were redrafting their constitution. And she said, don't look to the to the United States Constitution. Look to the South African Constitution as an example to follow. And one of the reasons she said this is because South Africa is unique amongst countries around the world for not only promoting our negative rights, in other words, our right not to be interfered with in the exercise of our freedoms. That includes everything from your right to not be detained unfairly, your right to freedom of speech, your right to freedom of political affiliation, your property rights, etc. But it also includes a whole host of positive rights. And I would encourage those of you who haven't read the Bill of Rights in a very long time to really familiarize yourself with this incredibly important part of our Constitution, which deals with the positive rights of citizens in our country. And it also includes a variety of really, really unusual provisions, which you won't find in other constitutions. And I'm going to name a few of those. Our Bill of Rights gives our people the right to have access to adequate housing. It puts an obligation on the state to make reasonable legislative and other measures within its available resources to achieve the progressive realization of this right. So this is a positive right that is embedded in our constitution. It is not party affiliated, it's not an ask, it is a demand of anyone who governs our society and people who are judging those governments in civil society to deliver on the right to access to adequate housing. We have rights in Section 27 in our country to healthcare, to food and to water and social security. These are rights that are enshrined in our constitution. Everyone has these rights. And there's even special mention under our rights in terms of healthcare, of reproductive healthcare, a really, really important right, particularly for women in a country where often culturally women are not given bodily autonomy. And of course, that's true all over the world. Where we have the right to sufficient food and water, we have the right to social security if we are unable to support ourselves. Again, this is not an ask, it's not a favor, it is a fundamental right that's built into our constitutional framework. Lastly, I want to highlight the fact that children have rights in our country to basic nutrition, to shelter, to basic healthcare services and social services, to protection from malpractice, maltreatment, neglect, etc., and exploitative labor practices. These are positive rights that place a responsibility, a burden on our country, our government, and our society to ensure that certain progressive basic human rights in terms of access to resources are made available. And then there are other positive rights, including the right to an environment that is clean and protected, and so on and so forth. And the reason I bring up these positive rights, and I bring up the fact, that they are celebrated all over the world in parts of the country in parts of the world that don't have such positive rights embedded in their constitution, is because I believe this is a blueprint that we often don't talk enough about in South Africa for what kind of country we can and should be building. We often offer and advance a variety of solutions to the challenges that we face, but we don't regularly talk about what the basic requirements are in terms of access to rights for every single person in our country. And those rights, as I said, include both political rights and the right to access to food, water, education, shelter, etc. So what is the role of civil society in both ensuring that members of our communities have access to these rights and in holding the government accountable, and also holding business and labor, the other two sectors that are often referred to as that make up the South African sort of social fabric? What is the role of civil society in holding all of these other sectors accountable for delivering on these progressive rights? And what can civil society do to promote knowledge amongst the people of our country about the fact that they are entitled to these rights? I think one of the things that is obviously a brake on our ability to deliver on these rights is the challenges that we experience in the economy. And that is something that we have seen borne out by a variety of things, but particularly the COVID-19 pandemic, which has in effect ground our economy to a standstill. It's exacerbated major challenges that we have already been experiencing with unemployment, which is just to say that a 36% unemployment rate in any country in the world is unthinkable. In most countries that have unemployment rates that are this high, the country is either emerging from a war, it's on the brink of war, it's a dysfunctional state. These are numbers that are unheard of. 11.7 million people at last count are unemployed in South Africa. So we're not building an economy that is conducive towards enabling our people to progressively realize these rights. And COVID-19 has really exposed the extent to which these obligations haven't been materially fulfilled. In addition, COVID-19 has shown how far we are from fulfilling the right to adequate healthcare for the people of our country. We have seen, hospital systems which are on the one hand unequal because people with access to private healthcare are able to access better quality than those who are dependent on the public system. But we've also seen in many parts of our country, the health system really buckle under the weight of COVID-19. And then, of course, the humanitarian response that we have had to see being implemented all over the country has demonstrated that our rights to food and water and housing and protection for children, as well as education, again, have not been adequately fulfilled. So it's really tragic to see that we are celebrating 25 years of the Constitution when actually we are sitting in a moment in our history as a country when it's really, really very clear that the principles of that Constitution have not been delivered on in the way that they should be. So what is the role of civil society in ensuring that they are? Well, civil society organizations and nonprofits in particular in South Africa have done some really extraordinary work in terms of public interest litigation in order to vindicate the rights of our people in the courts. And you will know, of course, Justice Mokgoro, having presided over a number of these cases, that access to housing, access to water, access to education, all of these progressive rights have been taken by civil society organizations on review in the Constitutional Court in order to hold the government accountable for failure to deliver. That's one of the areas in which civil society has been a really powerful partner for the people of our country. But what can civil society do as responsible citizens to aid in the delivery of these critical positive rights? In other words, what can civil society organizations do at the coalface of delivery to support government interventions, to support private sector interventions, and to ensure that they're going to the right people at the right time? And I think there's a lot of exciting possibilities for partnerships between the state, between business, and between a network of civil society organizations to ensure that rights are being delivered on the ground, but also to be able to point out where there are failures and where those failures need to be addressed on an urgent basis. And I think that's something we've been able to see in the wake of the tragic events of the past couple of weeks, where we've experienced unrest in Gauteng and KwaZulu-Natal on the one hand, and then taxi wars in the Western Cape on the other. It really is an example of how the rule of law, the social fabric, and inequality in our country are major, major challenges. How the social fabric is not holding together, and how people are so desperate and so lacking in the resources needed to live good lives that they are willing and able to subvert the rule of law, join in the mob, and grab, illegally acquired stock, food, clothing, etc., from stores and from shopping centers around the country. It really has exposed the extent to which our democracy is in a very fragile space. But following that unrest, we have seen a lot of civil society organizations, small charities in communities around the country, coming together not only to assist with the cleanup, but also to assist with humanitarian support and to deliver a really urgent response to people who are, cut off from the supply chain of food, whose desperation led to them even considering looting in the first place. And so I think there is a roadmap for us to consider civil society as a kind of first response to the challenges of delivering on the progressive rights which are realized in our Constitution. I also think that where civil society can play a big role is in changing South Africa from a country of criminalism, a criminal state, to a country where respect for the rule of law and a belief in the rule of law is paramount. Another thing that the looting and the unrest have demonstrated is the extent to which, when you have corruption that lives and breathes at the top of the government and the private sector, that drips into a society like poison, and people start to feel a sense of impunity, a belief that if our senior leaders are able to steal with impunity without going to jail, without facing consequences, then the same must be true for us as citizens. When you live in a society in which the most senior leadership have no respect for the rule of law, where the rule of law is undermined by those who are supposed to lead, that inevitably filters down into the society, and it filters down in the form of petty corruption, people paying bribes to police officers to evade tickets, to evade arrest, and then it explodes in times of crisis where people of all social backgrounds, people from middle income and upper income families to the very poorest of the poor, feel, well, you know, stealing is happening in our country on a daily basis. So, you know, everyone is looting, I'd better join in. So I think we have a fundamental challenge as a society to encourage civil society organizations to instill a respect for the rule of law in our society beyond just holding those in senior leadership accountable, but ensuring that communities in every part of the country, at every socioeconomic level, in every racial and ethnic and religious group, are adherents to the rule of law, respect the rule of law, and promotes legal and constitutional integrity in everything that they do. So I want to just conclude by saying we need to consider this 25-year celebration of the signing of the Constitution as an opportunity to review the extent to which the Constitution is a blueprint. It's a blueprint for the public service, it's a blueprint for business, it's a blueprint for labor, and it's a blueprint for civil society. As South Africans, we can all agree that both the negative and the positive rights enshrined in our Constitution are not adequately being protected, and that we as leaders, as community leaders, as political leaders, as business leaders, and as leaders in academia have a deep and profound responsibility to start to instill both the values of the Constitution and the progressive realization of the rights in the Constitution in our social fabric. Otherwise, it'll just remain, as we always say, a document on paper rather than a living example of South Africa's values and the values that the South African state and its people subscribe to. Thank you very much, Chairperson.
Thank you so much for such a lovely input. You know, it's interesting because Judge Mukhoro suggested that our democracy is a violent democracy. And she used GBV as an example of that violence, but violence that then impoverishes its people and also has a lot who are just so poor as the majority. So that's a violent society. You've added a layer and said we also have a criminal state, not just a violent state, but also a criminal state where the rule of law should be supreme, but it's not. Where a poisoned society, as you put it, where government and the private sector leaders tend to just encourage that kind of behavior. So thank you for that thought-provoking input. I'd like us to then just take on the next speaker on the role of business, because clearly Lindy were kind of suggested that business is also culpable in building this society. So can I get Ntate Bonang Mohale, who needs no introduction really, to then tell us about the role of business. Thank you very much, Prof.
Ntate Sello Hatang, thank you very much. Protocol observed. My video has just come on. Thank you very much. I've been trying very hard to enable it, but the administrator is actually quite good. Thanks also to Honorable Minister Ronald Lamola. It's wonderful to see honorable again, isn't it? Mayor Justice Yvonne Mukhoro, we dialed in together at just before 8 o'clock, and we shared a cup of coffee virtually. So for me, Let me start where Honorable Minister Lamola left off, because this thing called liberal democracy rests on 4 pillars. The first is a free press. The second is constitutional democracy, which is what we are talking about today. The third is an independent civil society. And then the last is the rule of law. All 4 of them that are hugely challenged in South Africa at this time, in this country, in this context, when so many of us dare to hope that joy and peace will prevail. So when one looks, therefore, at our constitution, and it is asserted and absolutely accepted to be the best in the world, it's not the best in the world because we are clever, it's the best in the world because we came last. The last one who came after us is South Sudan, who are probably celebrating their 10th anniversary this year. Because we stole from the Canadian experience as to how they empower women parliamentarians, from the Bumiputra experience in Malaysia as to how you can include indigenous people into the mainstream of the economy. For me, it is the best, not only because in section 195, it talks about the duties of the executives. And it's said because the majority of them don't even read that section, which is really their job description. It is also not the best because it has this Bill of Rights. But for me, it is the best contained in the preamble, the 1-page preamble of our Constitution, because there, this profound intent of our forebears is contained. And it starts by saying, we the people. My words, not the politicians. It says recognizing the past injustices. And then in the body of that Constitution, it then implores and mandates both you and I to rectify these past injustices. Because all of us collectively have not succeeded in eradicating the legacy of apartheid. It guarantees for me no less than the 3 freedoms of speech, of association, but the most profound one that Judge Yvonne Mukhoro and the minister and now Usislindiwe Mazibuko touches on is this notion of freedom from hunger. And it says it is the duty of the state to ensure that that is also progressively eliminated. But there's also a role for business to play in that part, because business has a disproportionate voice, disproportionate resources. Pre-COVID, business employed 13.5 million people. Government in all 3 spheres, 2.3 million. Now it's down to 1.3 million. Business understands this notion of project management, delivering mega projects on time, on budget, and in full. Whereas most governments everywhere else in the world, and ours is particularly bad, the cost would quadruple, the time will at least double. We are still battling with Midupi, Kusile, and Ingula, which we should have completed in 2017, and we are still busy today, and with no end in sight. 13 years later, after we experienced the first blackouts introduced in the lexicon of this country, even in apartheid South Africa, we haven't fixed the rolling blackouts. But the preamble for me, it's magical because it ends with a hymn by Enoch Sontonga, the healing song, Nkosi Sikelel' Africa, which is now a national anthem in 5 other African countries, excluding us, where we were gifted this notion of reconciliation. And we took absolutely the worst, the stem from the apartheid, and we included it because that's part of our rich history. And then we put in some English words, which really is the last stanza of the stem van Zuid-Afrika. And the last line of that, it says, we shall live and strive for freedom in South Africa, our land. Very aspirational indeed, because in 2017, the last land audit done by this ANC-led government demonstrates beyond any shadow of doubt that of farmland owned by individuals, 72% is still owned by white people. And Africans, only 4% of farmland, 27 years into democracy. For me, as a people with great natural endowments, we now stand under the same flag. We sing the same anthem, and yet poverty still has primarily a black and feminine face, as confirmed by Justice Lamola. And we don't have plans in place to accelerate that, in spite of the fact that on his 5th State of the Nation address, our President, Madam Ramaphosa, for the first time didn't give us a wish list of 20, 30 things that needed to be accomplished that year, but distilled and synthesized the 4 foremost overarching priorities. And it starts rightly by saying we have to overcome this coronavirus pandemic. Number 2, he says we need to accelerate our economic recovery. Thirdly, he says we need to implement the socio-economic reforms that we've been talking about for the last 10 years to bring about sustainable jobs and deliver this notion of an inclusive socio-economic growth. Lastly, he says we need to defeat state capture and create a capable state. The current reality is that 27 years into democracy, I think inequality is widening. Racism is at an all-time high. Black graduates are roaming the streets hopelessly. Public education has collapsed. Public healthcare continues to fail the poor and the vulnerable. And lawlessness has become an epidemic. Let me conclude just on 2 things that are very current, because our role as business is to be situational, because a leader is a product of the context. One is the pandemic that the president refers to as the number 1 priority. The last one is this looting, the 3 weeks of looting, even though we know that this started much longer and earlier than just the 3 weeks that absolutely traumatized the almost 60 million South Africans, mostly in KwaZulu-Natal and in Gauteng. Here, we witnessed the intersectionality amongst ethno-tribalism on the one hand, rampant criminality on the other, and genuine desperation on the other. And the genuine desperation is easy to understand, because by the time the pandemic found us, we were already prostate, face down, finished by 3 preceding events, the 9 years of state capture, even though the former president perfected state capture. He didn't invent it. He just went about it clumsily and embarked on industrial scale looting of epic proportions. We're already in a recession. Moody's didn't do us any favors by joining Fitch and Standard & Poor's in giving us a rating that is below investment grade. Today, we're at least 3 notches below investment grade, which makes borrowing for government, for business, and you and I much more expensive. Now the pandemic comes, not to create these grotesque inequalities, but to simply accentuate them. Because only 14.6% of households have direct access to the internet. So when you talk about notions of social distancing, of self-quarantine when you've been exposed, of washing your hands with soap and water and running water, and wearing a mask, knowing that 17 million of South Africans are on social security, 11.7 million are living below the poverty datum line and indeed unemployed. 10 million young people are not in education, employment, or training. That on an expanded definition, our unemployment rate is 43.2%. Youth unemployment is 74%. The elements that were present in the Arab Spring are here immediate and real. And why it took us so long for this country to go up in flames, we can only put it to the patience of our people. I think it also exposed the policy missteps that we have taken. Here we have not only a momentous failure of intelligence, but you don't need intelligence when you're about to incarcerate a former head of state, a former commander-in-chief, but also head of intelligence in the ANC, who's used his largesse to convert KwaZulu-Natal to be the biggest province of the ANC crucible of the electorate just by buying votes. We had 3 months to contemplate what sentence to give to him when he decided not to obey the Commission of Inquiry into State Capture that he himself was forced to initiate, that which he himself wrote the terms of reference for and expanded and wanted to go back to 1652 so that by the time we get to this era, he would probably be dead. Decided that he was going to be in contempt of court, in a court of law. And the apex court even respectfully writes to him to say, what sentence do you think will be appropriate for you? To show that it has moved beyond guilty or not. And yet we were found to be woefully inadequate, that we were not prepared at all. And how did this manifest? We chose a South African police service that is at least 100,000 personnel less, because we said we wanted a small SAPS that is intelligence-led. And then we go on and loot the state security agency to make sure that it has absolutely no resources. And these police, women and men, often don't even have sufficient cars, not enough bulletproof vests, not enough rubber bullets, not even enough canisters to disperse this crowd, not enough live ammunition. And we wonder why they just stood and watched, if not aided and abetted this looting, where we looted 1,200 ATMs, a blood bank, and spirited the blood on the floor. Warehouses whose job it is to store the medicines that are needed by the hospitals that might help us. We stole 57,600 vaccines that need to be kept on a cold chain of minus 70 degrees Celsius. We chose to absolutely cripple the backbone of this economy in terms of its not only value chain, but supply chain, the N3 and the N2. There was no response. When Amatela Ngubona in KwaZulu-Natal went on to demand, mostly from construction companies, state-owned enterprises and state-owned companies, equity for free just because some of them consider themselves to be members of MKMVA, just because they say we have liberated this country, when our executives, the people who call themselves our leaders, have been hiring their own friends and relatives, and they think they can now go to society and also take that which doesn't belong to them. When they closed most of the economic activity in KwaZulu-Natal and issued an edict that you cannot even bury in KwaZulu-Natal unless you're a funeral parlor from KwaZulu-Natal, in direct contravention of our own constitution. In broad daylight, they went to Richards Bay Mineral and assassinated the general manager in broad daylight, and there was absolutely no response. These MKMVA go to Nkandla to say we are going to protect the former president. You have to go through us. Again, contravening the Disaster Management Act. Again, no action, no social distance, no wearing of masks, thereby sending a strategic conversation that it's okay to break the law and you can get away with it, like we've been doing probably in the 9 wasted years. And to see the Value Logistics warehouse being looted for 72 hours non-stop, even beyond the 2100 hours curfew that has been set, and again, no action. 200 malls, 800 businesses that were absolutely decimated, more than 330 lives lost. So what needs to be done as I conclude? You see, what drives the share price? It's rumor and speculation. I think as business, starting with ourselves, we need to continue to do well by doing good, because when business does well, society generally does well. Business cannot continue to be an island of prosperity in a sea of poverty. Business needs to take seriously this notion of job creation, because when they create jobs, it's not in and of itself. They are creating markets of the future, because there's a problem when you're a business and your own employees cannot afford the products and the services that you provide. But the large chunk of this stays in government's corner, because those are elected leaders. Number one, I think they need to get the top state capture miscreants to jail, because you can't take that which doesn't belong to you. 1.4 trillion South African rands in just the first 5 years. That's 2/3 of what it takes Edward Kisveta to collect in a year through the South African Revenue Service and get away with it, and there are no consequences. Number two, we need to procure vaccines as a matter of urgency, because vaccine rollout has always been a race, because the country that can achieve herd immunity first, and therefore say we've defeated this coronavirus pandemic, will reap the pent-up global tourism demand. Tourism matters for us because pre-COVID, it was 9.8% of our GDP, 10.2 million visitors visited the shores. And during the first lockdown, that number came down to less than 3 million and continues to languish at those levels. We need to reduce government debt. It's unsustainable. We need to reduce the public sector wage bill. 70% of what is collected by SARS goes only to 3 buckets: social security, public sector wage bill, and debt servicing. We borrow at a rate of 2.1 billion a day, every day. That's pre-COVID. Before we went to borrow the 577 billion socio-economic stimulus. We need to fix the more than 740 state-owned enterprises and state-owned companies. Lastly, we need to migrate from analog to digital. This digital migration we've been talking about for the last 10 years, 5 ministers later. Why are we not auctioning the spectrum is just beyond me. If you make the decision on Tuesday, on Friday you can bank 20 billion but we are still held up in some ideological warfare in our own heads, whilst our people are dying out of hunger at our most vulnerable moment. This ANC-led government demonstrated beyond a shadow of doubt that it is unable to protect its own citizens. Thank you
so much, Prof. Mohale, for that. Again, you know, you were painting a picture like one was not there. As you were telling us about what happened, it still feels unreal. So thank you so much for painting this picture and how all of us have a role to play to ensure that we never go back there. And thank you for also stipulating what needs to be done in tangible terms. I also need to note that I liked how you start with finally, lastly, and as I conclude, as I hand over, you know, Ronald Lamola didn't do that. I was expecting it from him. And no, finally, let me conclude. As I close, thank you so much again for, you know, the picture is so clear in my mind that we had too many missteps. When you are saying there was failure of big leadership, our inadequacy in addressing what was coming, and our ill-preparedness, indecisiveness in leadership, that there was no voice, no one saying anything for a long time. And that, again, is a reminder that we need to rely on little leadership, if you like, when big leadership fails. And in this case, big leadership failed, and we needed then to just rely on small leadership. Let me, at this point, bring in Fasia Hassan, who again needs no introduction, someone who was very active in the Fees Must Fall movement, someone who then moved on to get into the Gauteng legislature. And like Tate Mohale pointed out, it's so good to now keep saying honorable when you're dealing with people who actually are this honorable. Fasia Hassan, over to you.
Thank you. Oh, I need to change my background from a previous panel. Give me a moment. It's because I hadn't turned on my background prior to this. All right. Thank you very, very much to Silo and to everybody who I'm very happy to be able to share this panel with, to the Minister, to the former Justice, to Sis Lindy Zibuko. I'm saying Sis, not Ao, so Mom, you must note that. And I'm also really, really, really grateful to be able to be a young person to lend my voice to the space. So I'm going to say all protocol observed, and Mr. Mohale, of course, Professor Mohale, I hope I've acknowledged everybody who's here, as well as all the various bureaucrats and other departmental members. So we'll take it as protocol is observed. So yes, my name is Fasia Hassan. I wear a few hats, but perhaps the most important for this discussion, or the most relevant, is that I'm also a former Fees Must Fall activist and a youth leader. And I was also once a very wide-eyed law student at Wits University. I'm also the only panelist to have been born post-apartheid. And I think that's quite important because of this born-free idea. A different perspective, a different lived experience, and most importantly, a different narrative. And I think that's particularly important in a discussion like today, where 25 years of the Constitution is being discussed, and we're unpacking this idea of constitutionalism, because the majority of our population in South Africa is in fact under the age of 35. I know that's a youth league youth, but that's a different discussion. The reality is that majority young people, majority young women, which is very important, majority young Black women. And when you begin to unpack that and you look at the numbers behind it, which is very, very important in a discussion like this, you begin to see this crisis youth unemployment rates. And I think Prof. Mohale spoke to it, right? We've got two horrific stats that recently came out around youth unemployment. We've got 74.7% for under 24, or people under the age of 24, and 46.3% for people who are aged 24 to 35. So that's the age group that we are in. And that's the narrow definition. So it's probably much, much higher than that. We all know young people who are angry, who are disillusioned, You can even just simply scroll on any social media, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, or Snapchat. You're not really scrolling, but the reality is any social media, and you will see the disillusion of young people and how angry young people are by the current state of events, even worse so now since the most recent unrest. And even before that unrest, actually. And as a friend of mine coins it, the 2 weeks in July, and I said to him, this is going to become a book one day. But we as young people were warning the leadership. We were warning anyone who wanted to listen, the old guard, etc., that it was going to be a recipe for disaster. When you have crisis levels of youth unemployment, and I'm calling them crisis levels because that's what it should be coined, and I'm very particular in that wording, it's a ticking time bomb. The majority of young people in this country are sitting and twiddling their thumbs. You combine that with high levels of anger and disillusion, extreme levels of poverty and inequality. We spoke about gender-based violence, femicide, everything. And you are asking for a revolution. You are asking because you are putting all of these ingredients in one pot, and there's very few outcomes that can come from it unless there's major deliberate intervention. And I think it's very important to talk about it because even during our days as student leaders and Fees Must Fall activists, we very sharply raised this discussion in the Constitution between political freedom, political rights, and economic freedom and economic rights. And the reality is, you can't eat political freedom or political rights. You can't eat the right to assemble, the freedom of the press, the right to protest, all of which are fundamental rights, I agree, and we all concede. But the reality of it is it's not going to put food on the table. It's not going to clothe your children. It's not going to be able to help you see month to month. And that's where I think the core crisis is, that the economic rights of our people are not being addressed and not being looked at. And that's perhaps why the inclusion of socioeconomic rights in our Constitution is so fundamental. And Mamkhor also spoke to this at great length, which also, gave me some nostalgia because our law professors in those first few classes of constitutional law, I was actually very lucky to have Prof. Feroz Kuchalia, who was very involved in the drafting of that Constitution, teach us these different elements, your first, your second, your third generational rights. But the inclusion thereof, and this is the most important point of what I'm trying to make now, is that is one of the main reasons of what makes our Constitution progressive. That unlike the American Constitution and others, there is a specific inclusion of, example, the right to water, right? To clean, accessible water, for example. The right to housing and all these different things that are fundamentally important to creating not just a democratic state, but an egalitarian and a more equal and fair society. So this Constitution, the preamble, the Bill of Rights, everything that we've spoken to, everything in between, those are our ideals as a society. And as Minister said, it's the lighthouse that guides us. In fact, when I started law school, my father gifted me with his first copy of the Constitution, which I have with me. And it was a very important thing for me because it was one of the first prints of the Constitution. It had come from my father, who was an anti-apartheid activist. He was also a young leader and public representative in the earlier years of democracy. But it was almost as if there was a passing on of not just the baton, but these ideals. The idea of what you want a South African society to look like. The idea that we as young people now are being handed not necessarily the echelons of power, but the ideas of what we want to build our society around. And I regularly keep it with me. I've laminated it. I keep it even when I'm in legislature sittings and when we have these different panels, because for me, it's a symbol of why this Constitution is important. That there's an entire generation of young people like myself and others who, yes, are incredibly angry and are incredibly disillusioned. But we are also young people who have to live in this country and who have to, we're in our 20s, we have hopefully, many, many more years to live. And as a result of that, you find that you have no other choice but to be some level of an idealist, some level of, yes, we must lift up the mirror and be harsh, and we must be very honest about the failures of government, the failures of public representatives before us, and the failures of where we have not been able to implement this Constitution well enough. But at the same time, and this is why you can see there can be contradictory ideas that hold true at the same time, also be idealists and also say that, well, actually, we have no other choice but to believe that we can reimagine a new future because we have to. We don't have another choice. The alternative is a revolution, and we saw a little bit of it coming up now over the last 2 weeks, and we saw our society cave. We saw people incredibly afraid. We saw those racial dynamics, which we talk about, but we've not really done enough over and above the TRC to really deal with it. You saw young people who just wanted to give up, and more importantly, young people who were in extreme poverty turning to looting, because what other choice did they have? In addition to, of course, the other political natures of why we saw what we saw. But I also want to challenge this idea of a new apartheid, and I'm waiting. Sizwe is yet to send me the book. I'm looking forward to it, but I think it's very important because, yes, we have a crisis of privatization, and yes, we have a crisis of commodification. But the reality also is that the world is rife with inequality, right? South Africa included. Perhaps South Africa is an excellent case in point, but it is also the result of capitalism, colonialism, and of course apartheid, and those racial policies which successfully dismantled our society and successfully created a crisis, even to this point where we are unable to rebuild even a family structure or a family unit. Beyond all the policies of social grants, all of that, more young people who I interact with in social circles and political circles will tell you they don't have an active or present father. We'll still link it to migrant labor. We'll be able to tell you that they have this very different ideal for how they want to raise their families. And it seems like something arbitrary, but it's not. It shows you how deep and how deep that level of inequality, and I think that abuse and that discrimination really is. Because even though we were born in a post-apartheid system, that doesn't mean that we fully overcome it. And yes, I think we have removed a fair amount of those policies that came from the apartheid system, which is a huge victory. But we're yet to successfully dismantle the private sector in terms of lily-white boardrooms, lack of representation of women of color, of young people. I mean, even when I did my stint in corporate law, I can tell you right now that there's no transformation there, that there's still extreme racism happening in those spaces. And this is also where I think the Constitution is fundamentally important. It is a fundamental tool to doing this dismantling. And therefore our Constitution is more of what, or my opinion, is more of what unites us than divides us. And I'd say so this across racial lines. Because even when we saw, before the unrest, even when we saw this huge attack on the Constitution, when you asked different people, there was this feeling of, well, at least that Constitution there, the Constitution is clear, the rule of law is clear. We know that our court system and our judiciary is safe, and we know that they are the ones who are going to be arbiters, but in a way that is objective and in a way that won't succumb to that kind of political pressure. And of course, that's also fundamentally linked to our Constitution, right? Which, as we know, constitutional supremacy is one of the fundamental tenets of this democracy, and is also, like I keep saying, one of the reasons why we remain alive, the reason why we've survived this extreme attack, just both on the Constitution, but also on our democracy. So for me, this constitutionalism idea, in as much as there are all of these difficulties, it's more than just a document. It is the soul of our people. It is the soul of this new South Africa that I was born into and so many other young people were born into. But we also must be honest. We need new ways of thinking about and implementing our Constitution. We have to do things differently. If we're going to do things in the same way and expect different outcomes, we know that's the definition of madness. So we have no other choice. Right? Or we have to face that horrific reality of inaction, potential revolution, and rising up of young people. But we also have to look at the fact that we have relied perhaps too much on a litigious implementation of the Constitution. And Lindiwe also spoke to this, and I want to echo a little bit of what she said, because this is also something that I think is a problem. In many ways, we have waited and allowed, unintentionally or intentionally, for various NGOs and social movements, parts of civil society and others, to enforce our constitutional duties to our people. Whether we look at the TAC, whether we look at early instances in our democracy, I think there's many examples, but the reality of the matter is we have a very litigious implementation of the Constitution, as opposed to an actual executive implementation, as opposed to a policy implementation, or more importantly, as opposed to a societal idea of that constitution. Like I said earlier, if you spoke to people about the constitution, they link it specifically to the judiciary, which is correct in many ways, but it shouldn't be the only space that we guard this constitution. And in fact, we shouldn't have to wait to be taken to court to actually implement those things. And I'm going to put on my hat as a lawmaker for a moment. I'm a member of the provincial legislature, I'm one of the youngest. And one of the things that happened at the beginning of the lockdown is we had, I sit in the Education Portfolio Committee, and we had actually agreed that we would not stop the school nutrition program, that the goods were already paid for, but more importantly, there's still a need, and that we were going to partner with social development to see how we could deliver that food to the different families of those children, where we knew that food security is an absolute crisis. Fast forward a few days, there was a different declaration made by the national government around the duties of when we feed children being outside, not being outside of the school premises. All of a sudden that program stopped, and it took Equal Education taking us to court, and the Constitutional Court saying, how dare you stop this program, how dare you stop feeding children, to tell us what we already knew, that children still needed food and still needed to be looked after in that way. So sometimes what you see is these bureaucracies and these ideas hindering the constitution and also hindering common sense. If young people who are going to school didn't have a meal at home today, they're most certainly not going to have a meal during lockdown because their parents are unable to work. So you see all these different elements in different ways. And I think it's something where we still need to unpack that more specifically. And I think that's why today's discussion is important. Now, before I don't want to be this person who says before I conclude, I have two more points to make. And I think these are important points, and they might ruffle a few feathers, but I think it's fundamental to talk about and to think about. What the last 9 years has also done, apart from the rampant corruption and state capture, we know all of that. We've been watching the Zondo Commission, we've been reading with horror everything that has been going on. But there's a flip side of that coin, and it's a conversation I had with another youth activist recently, that in some ways, there's been a sharpening of our democracy. This full-on assault on our constitution, but the constitution still having survived and showing that they were not able to dismantle it is also evidence of the strength and the power of this constitution, but also of Chapter 9 institutions. All of a sudden now, if you ask a layperson on the side of the street who's the public protector, they'll be able to tell you that. And I was hoping Mamtuli Madansela would have been here, because the reality is that before all of this, before we saw what was going on, people didn't even know who the public protector was. People didn't even know why it was important or why it was in the public interest. And one of the consequences, directly or indirectly, of what we saw is a more actively involved nation, not just in the politics of how things work, I mean the factional politics of the ANC aside, but the reality of how government functions and why it's important for us as a citizenry to get involved and to be more alert around those things. Even in Parliament, I sit in portfolio committees now where the chairperson and others will say, you know, actually there's so much scrutiny now on Parliament because questions in the Zondo Commission of where was Parliament, what were they doing when this happened. Now you're seeing public representatives and those sitting in portfolio committees actually saying, you know, I'm going to ask harsher questions. I'm going to be more particular. I'm going to be more deliberate because we have a much bigger role to play here. And that's in some ways the flip side of the coin. I'm not saying we should have gone through those 9 years to come to it. I think that's a huge flaw. But that's something that was an unintended consequence. And maybe that's also where we need to be focusing our energies. And now lastly, one of the ways that I think we need to relook at the Constitution, and now I say this as a young person, as an activist, also as an angry young person, we need our communities to lead us, not the other way around. And it's a profound change in how we do leadership and how we do governance, and even how we look at our Constitution. Often there's this thinking that, or let me rephrase that, sometimes I think that our Constitution was drafted in a way where it assumed the best of our leaders, that we had the most humble, the most selfless, the most constitutionally respecting leaders. And the reality of the matter is that we don't have that. And that's what I'm trying to show now, that we need to change the lens and flip that around. And rather the focus being on leadership, rather the focus be in our communities. Let us partner with our communities and let us ensure that our communities lead us in terms of the solution-based approach, not just a group of people sitting in a boardroom thinking they know what's best for society, but being so detached from the realities on the ground. So yes, young people must be at the forefront of that. Like I said, the majority of the country are young. When I talk about communities, I just mean specifically young people in young communities must be at the forefront. And the reality of the matter is that the old guard and everybody who's still is in existence, they can choose to work with us. You can help us open the door, or we will kick it down, because young people are coming. And you can see it both in terms of the unrest and the looting, but you're also seeing it in civil society, in the private sector, in politics. We as young people are done waiting. We're done wanting or allowing people to make decisions on our behalf. And the reality is it's going to take us to change this country and to turn things around. So when we talk about this constitution and this constitutionalism through a youth lens, this country is also ours. And if the old guard is unable to fix it, perhaps what needs to happen is that they hand over to us and we think completely differently about how we've been applying this constitution up to now. But more importantly, we take bold and radical decisions to fundamentally change it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Fasiha, nothing has changed since I last saw you. Your feistiness is still there, and despite having this position that you're now occupying. And I'm hoping that you will retain that because that's what we kind of need, leaders who feel that they still have to say the unsayable. So please keep saying the unsayable, but also do something about it where you can. So I like how you again just kept on reminding us that we have too many disaffected, disillusioned, and angry young people. And unless something changes fundamentally, we'll have a situation where, like what's happening now, where one of the aspects of things that we forget about is that schools were also vandalized during this period. School feeding schemes have fallen into disarray as a result. Tomorrow we'll be in KZN dealing with the school feeding schemes as the Nelson Mandela Foundation to try see how we can supplement and help where we can, because people went in, took the food from the school feeding schemes, and that's what we then need to be dealing with. Your use of the old guard. I was trying to, one of the sad things is that the video is not on. I wanted to see the current company, how their reaction to the old guard, but they are not the old guard. They are very young. So thank you very much again, Fasia. May I remind all the people who are following us today that you can use the chat function just to ask your questions now, and I'll be fielding those throughout the program. I've seen your questions, people like Zakele, Jele, and I've seen all those questions that you've put forward, and I will then be asking those just after the next speaker. I'd like us to please welcome Methuli Madonsela, who's a professor at Stellenbosch University. And I need to just congratulate you once more. Methuli Madonsela just recently, as recent as last week, on the 18th of July, she summited Mount Kilimanjaro for the second time with the Caring for Girls program to try raise funds to help girl children through schooling. So congratulations once again, Prof, for summiting Mount Kilimanjaro. I can hear Justice Mokgoro can't contain her excitement. She couldn't contain her excitement and she started screaming there. Prof. Madonsela, over to you.
Right. Thank you, Silo Patang, Program Director, for the kind remarks. And thank you to the Minister of Justice and team for the privilege to be part of this worthy conversation. And all I'm requesting to you, Minister of Justice, is that we have this conversation annually. And in each year, we reflect on what has shifted since we had this conversation. I align myself with pretty much most of what I've heard from the two speakers who spoke just before me. My intention is to engage you very briefly about transformative constitutionalism for social justice and peace. the role of academics. As you know, in my new life, I'm back into academia, having rejected a number of opportunities that were more prestigious and more highly paying. But I came back to academia because what I'm about to say to you about the role of the academy in advancing, anchoring, and supporting democracy is something that has always been critical in our history and the history of the world. It is said that in China, ancient China, poets used to be paid to criticize government, to keep government abreast of societal perceptions of its performance. This is similar to the Venda Makatsi, who we know that in ancient Venda, I'm not sure whether it's still the same now, was a sort of the eyes and ears of the king and the voice of the people. And she would find out what the people were saying in terms of feedback about how they were being governed, and would reflect these views back to the king. And they would say a king would ignore her counsel at his or her own peril. And I do know that in Zambia, there's a tribe that actually killed kings that didn't do what they expected to do. But fortunately here, the kings listened to the appropriate people. Going back to the academy, from time immemorial, academics have performed a similar role of giving feedback back to governments. But academics in this country and elsewhere, if we think about Machiavelli among other academics, did more than criticize. They have often shown the way and even built prototypes of the things that they suggested government build. For example, apartheid immensely depended on academic input. If we think about the Carnegie Commission report of 1932, which sought to deal with white poverty, a lot of the people that were involved in crafting that report and the solutions that were accepted by the Carnegie Commission, which we should go back to actually and ask for them to come and remedy the injustice that they were part of. But the report that came from that commission came mostly from academic inputs. And incidentally, some of those involved came from my current institution. We also have to remember though that some of the academics that have given us views on how to dismantle the socioeconomic legacy of colonialism and apartheid also are academics that have come from these institutions. For example, from my institution, Stellenbosch University, we have Professor Sam Peter Blanche, who gave his whole life to documenting how colonialism and apartheid created an unequal society in terms of wealth, in terms of resources, in terms of culture and art and everything in society, and even suggested to this government that has been governing for 27 years how to dismantle that legacy. And currently the Vice Chancellor of Stellenbosch University, Professor Tivelius, is one of those who points out how the past informs the present. Recently, he took us on a walk with Stellenbosch, Visit Stellenbosch, where we were shown what was taken away from the colored community and how the university benefited from that and other members of the Stellenbosch community, and invited all of us to do something about it as part of the social justice quest of the university. Some of you would know Beyers Naudé, who was an academic and also a cleric, who once he had been on the road to Damascus and understood that apartheid was evil, was part of dismantling his legacy. And I'm here before you because of the scholarship he provided for people like me, which is why I'm passionate about Action for Inclusion, which is making sure that student debt does not prevent young people from completing university. And I disagree with those who say a high school education, post-high school education is unimportant. We should only deal with basic education. I think all forms of education are important. As Nelson Mandela said, education is one powerful weapon that we can use to transform the world, both in terms of cleansing the mind, but also giving people opportunities to do better for themselves, which is why, for example, I'm one of those who has experienced the low-lying fruits of democracy. Now, if we want to know how academics can help to move democracy forward, the starting point should be what is wrong with democracy and where can academics play a role today. But just going back to the past, when the ANC came back to the country, as academics, we played a major role in shaping whatever constitutional input they had initially. I remember from KELS under the leadership of Feroz Kachalia that we were responsible for example, for refining the property clause to include public interest. We were responsible for introducing the right to social security among the other tweaks that we included in the draft that they had as their ready to govern documents. So, but back to where we are right now. I invite you, dear colleagues, and particularly people from the Department of Justice and Constitutional Development and Correctional Services, to think about an iPhone. An iPhone is a great phone with enormous capabilities. But to people like me, who were born before technology, there isn't much of a difference between an iPhone and a Motorola. In fact, some of the photos that I take with my iPhone are laughed at by some of the people on my Twitter timeline who say, I use the iPhone as if I'm using a Motorola. So what has that got to do with our democracy? Like me, you probably on a daily basis come across people who say we don't want democracy. We fought for freedom and this democracy is not working for us. It's doing to us exactly what apartheid did to us. Through apartheid, we had specific laws that did these things to us and we had past laws that did these things to us. That limited our freedom and stifled our ability to free our potential. Today, poverty does the same and inequality does the same. And many blame it on the Constitution. Walisa Musa is one of those. And some people that attended a Tuma event on democracy, the People versus Democracy, said the same. I am convinced that the problem is not with democracy and the problem is not with the Constitution. The problem is with the implementers of the Constitution. And in that regard, I align myself with the previous two speakers that we need our policy makers, those who are driving the implementation of the Constitution, to change gear, to improve their eyes, to start looking at the capabilities of our Constitution and exploit all of those capabilities. Because it can't be right, dear colleagues, that we have one of the best constitutions in the world, a constitution that talks about healing the divisions of the past and establishing a society founded on democratic values, social justice, and fundamental human rights. And then today, we've become the most unequal society in the whole world, which means we're moving in the opposite direction to that which the Constitution asks us to go. Unemployment is at its height. And I remember during the past administration, we kept saying, oh, it's because of the world, the collapse of the world economy. But other countries were growing and other countries were improving inequality. Firstly, using the Millennium Development Goals and more recently using the Sustainable Development Goals. So certainly the reason we are becoming more unequal is not because of our past. It is because we were unequal, but we are failing to reduce that inequality despite the Constitution, not because of the Constitution. Yes, the Constitution constrains the speed with which you can move, but the Constitution does not stop us from moving. And regarding the role of academics, My son yesterday gave us an example of collaboration. He asked us a question that had 5 dimensions, and he said the person to answer that question should answer all 5 correctly. And in the room, none of us could answer it. And what he wanted to demonstrate was that no leader has all of the answers. The leader that is going to be able to provide answers and to move forward efficiently and effectively is one who knows how to harness together a group that has different pieces of the answer. And I think apartheid leaders knew how to do that. And I think the Mandela government knew how to do that. That's how some of us ended up being in government. I think in recent years, the relationship between government and academia has been a little bit checkered. Perhaps part of it is our fault in that we only speak to government when we criticize, and we haven't done enough in coming forward to say, this is what we think can be done. So I'm not blaming government, I'm not blaming us, I'm just saying we haven't really used each other's strengths to move things forward. And where can we help each other? Where can we as academics help government? It is around building peace. And I do think that to build peace, we have to make a difference on social justice. This morning I tweeted and I said, peace will remain elusive as long as justice, which is peace's twin, is missing. My statement, which you may discern, was about the symbiotic relationship between justice and peace, received mixed reactions. One that caught my attention is one that said there'll be no peace until President Zuma, who has been imprisoned without a trial and whose authority to appoint a judge for the commission of inquiry was taken away, is released. So this provides you with an example of what are some of the challenges. And I'm going to say to you, there are 2 challenges that we have. One is the challenge of social justice. The other one is being in the age of misleaders, the age of lies, the age of half-truths. And some people say, this is fake news. They give it a nice moniker, which is fake news. It's not fake news. It is just lies, and it's not fake news. But the combination now of misleaders and social injustice is the greatest threat to democracy today. And who are the misleaders? The misleaders may be people who have been benefiting from patronage, because in the face of social injustice, it's been difficult to penetrate into the center of the economy. And then they use political patronage to get in. And if you take away political patronage, what are they left with when you haven't made it easier for an ordinary, decent person, hardworking person, to uplift themselves? And it's not about jobs. I disagree with the colleagues that say all we have to do is to give people jobs. That's what Fairwood wanted people to get. Fairwood wanted Black people to only have jobs. We have to open inroads for Black people into the economy directly, not through BE, not through some 25% stake in someone else's business or 5% stake. That should be an addition. We should open up the economy to women, people with disabilities, Black people, rural people, township people, into the economy itself. In so doing, we grow the economy, as was done after the Carnegie Report of 1932. But also we avoid the mistake of reinforcing racism by giving the impression that Black people can only be advanced if they get a stake in existing white business. So I'm not saying that shouldn't be done, but I'm saying we should do more than that. Just in ending, therefore, just going back to the State Capture Commission, lies and no lie, I just want to answer that question and say, firstly, no one has a right to choose a judge. So it's not an injustice if you've not been given an opportunity to choose a judge to judge you. But secondly, President Zuma was not denied the opportunity to appoint the judge of the Commission of Inquiry. I'll give you an example. Selection and appointment are 2 separate processes. The public protector is selected by Parliament and appointed by President Zuma. And I've never heard these liars saying that the president never appointed the public protector because he didn't select the public protector. So we're living in a toxic age of lies, but these lies get legs and they get power on their own because we have a population that is unhappy because people are hungry and angry, and therefore they don't discern when they're being told these lies. So how can we help you as academics? Minister of Justice, Minister Lamola, you're the first Minister of Justice, for example, to respond to our request to please implement Chapter 5 of the Equality Act. After President Mbeki tried very hard to get us to implement the Equality Act in its fullest, once he left, nothing was done to implement the Equality Act in its fullest. There was science behind the Equality Act because apartheid left us unequal, such as if you've been through a monopoly game where Team Blue was given all of the opportunity to run and properties were even taken away from Team Pink. After years of playing that monopoly game, without resetting the game, you say Team Pink can start now when all of the properties are in the hands of Team Blue. You cannot then say that the only thing you have to do is to make sure that there's no discrimination, because the social power that used to be hard power in the hands of the state will now be in Team Blue. They are the gatekeepers. They have all of the properties. When you land on their property, you are dead. So you need some kind of reset button. And the Equality Act was giving us that opportunity to reset. Hence, we had Chapter 5, which was about get some equality plans, get an assessment of where inequality persists, get some equality plans done, and that was not done. Higher education has done that. It has moved university to do something despite the failure to implement Chapter 5 of the Equality Act. England, which doesn't have a groundbreaking constitution such as ours, requires anybody in government who's about to pass a law, a policy, a program, to ask themselves questions around what will this mean for the equality protected people? So will this comply with the equality duty? They've got to do that. And the equality duty is not just non-discrimination, it's also will this reduce existing imbalances? So how are we planning to help you, Minister of Justice? Firstly, I want us to listen to what Steve Biko warned. What is the danger that lies ahead? And then I will end with the 4 points which we're putting forward. Steve Biko 4 decades ago said, there is no running away from the fact that now in South Africa, there's such an ill distribution of worth that any form of political freedom which does not touch on the proper distribution of wealth will be meaningless. The whites have locked up within a small minority of themselves the greater proportion of the country's wealth. If we have a mere change of face of those in governing positions, what is likely to happen is that Black people will continue to be poor, and you will see a few Black people filtering through the so-called bourgeoisie. Our society will be run almost as of yesterday. So for meaningful change to appear, there needs to be an attempt at reorganizing the whole economic pattern and economic policies within this particular country. It comes from the book No Fears Express. So 27 years into democracy, 40 years after Steve Biko, 44 years after Steve Biko, that has happened. Not because there's malice from government, not because there's no political will from government, it's just the science has failed you in government. It failed us too, because I was in government, is that what we didn't do was look at every law and think about how will this law impact on equality, which is what England has done. And we have invented a tool called SIAM, Social Justice Impact Assessment Matrix, that policymakers should make. We've seen, for example, that so far government and many academics reduce transformative constitutionalism to administrative law. And that is since that very beautiful Muranic article about the new constitution being there to ensure there's no impunity. And of course, the Nkandla judgment where the Chief Justice talks about the constitution being there to cut the ugly head of impunity. But what we want to say is that that's not even the crux of transformative constitutionalism. If you want to know what is the crux of transformative constitutionalism in our constitution, read the preamble, which is the vision of the society we're trying to build, and it rests on 3 pillars: democratic values, social justice, and fundamental human rights. If we don't create that society, which I think is a social democracy, we're not going to make headway on corruption. And also we will always have these liars, these gaslighters being there to create conditions for a pseudo revolution like happened in the Arab Spring. So here's what we're putting on board for you. I have indicated it's the SIAM and just a whole policy, a process of helping you to align whatever you want to do with equality. To the people, we have a project on everyday justice to get people to understand how the state works and how then they can be their own protectors in making sure that the right thing is done. And when there's something wrong that has been done, they ask the right questions to the right person. We've established a social justice hub and just generally ignited a revolution on social justice, getting everyone to understand that the key ethos of our constitution is to create a socially just society. And with the COVID-19 thing, we've created a structure that looks at monitoring everything and making sure that everything is aligned with social justice. And in that regard, we're saying to government, it's a mistake to reduce COVID-19 disruption to the economy and health. You're missing a whole chunk there of the disruption to social life, the disruption to the social fabric. The anger that you see in society is partly a mental health problem, partly a hunger, food security problem, but also just the disintegration of the social fabric because of the fears that come with the lockdown and the fears that come with COVID-19. So if we're talking about rebuilding better together, we can't just rebuild the economy and our health system, we should also rebuild our social fabric. We've also been talking to government about SDGs. The minister who passed on, we were very grateful that his department was very, Minister Mthembu, his department has been very receptive. And we're also grateful that the Department of Justice has become receptive to some of the discussions we had. We had somebody representing the department when we discussed the GBV bills. Lastly, we want to also help government with ethical governance, particularly using the ethical leadership model. So just moving forward, I would like to say government should start treating academia the way ancient China treated poems. Pay us to criticize you, pay us to provide you models, pay us to hold your hands, because you do pay our salaries. I mean, our salaries are partly paid by government. So there's no point in not using, unlike consultants who are working on these things for years and years and years. And you don't have to take everything we have to say, you just have to provide a platform for us to engage with you. Because the Ethiopians say, when spider webs combine, they can tie up a lion. And before us, it's the lion of saving our democracy through social justice and promoting good governance. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you so much. Thought-provoking as always. I can just imagine one of the worst things you can do is to climb any mountain with Prof. Madonsela. Because as you're climbing, she's telling you, ah, man, you know, this is what we should be doing. And now she has just challenged you, Minister, with the thoughts that she has given all of us, in fact, not just you, for us to be able to rebuild South Africa. I think I like most that we tend to focus on just rebuilding the economy. And she says that's not just the thing that we should be doing. And the looting of last week, last 2 weeks, shows that rebuilding the social fabric is just as important. Academia being a critical partner is one of those that we shouldn't forget. So I'm going to move straight on to the questions. And the first one that I want to put forward, because I think it should be one that's easy for particularly Justice Mokgoro to deal with, because she had already indicated that the Constitution is not sacrosanct. But the question from Zakela Jele says, how do we then change the constitution? What are the steps that we need to do to change the constitution so that it then can fulfill the needs of its people? The second one that I thought, but you can also just look at the chat, colleagues, the panelists in the chat group to see some of the questions that have come forward. And then there's an input from Nkobi who says, with the notion that the people shall govern, some people, recently JZ, have indicated that South Africans did not fight for constitutional democracy, but for democracy. Now these people have bemoaned instances where parliament, which is the extension of the people, takes decisions. And that's the crux of that question. Then comes the question from, and this is the last one, and then I'll hand over to you panelists, from Dimasha Kung, who says, but still Prof highlights all that which happened in the past 3 weeks. We also witnessed most South Africans that were patriotic. And this is an important one. People who actually said, we don't want South Africa to burn. We want to stop that. I think it's acknowledgement that there were people who didn't want to, as she says, give up now, and that they love South Africa. I think let me pause there and go back to you as panelists. Maybe let me finish off with this one from Mashiane Matopa, who says, Prof. Madonsela, good morning. I feel honored to interact with you. You spoke of lies, and my opinion is that our government tried to run our country based on lies. There were good intentions by our government from the beginning, but like they say good intentions are sometimes the quickest way to hell. So let me pause there, and then I'll go to the Q&A. After you've maybe come through with reactions to some of these questions. We've got about, give or take, about 40 minutes to go before we hand over to Dr. Mashabela for him to then close. So if I can then maybe ask panelists to come through. You might want to kick us off, and then I'll hand over to others who had questions directly, such as Prof. Madonsela.
Thank you, Silo, and thanks for that question. You remember in my address, I said, constitutional change should be necessary. Because constitutions are drafted in an enduring way, the provisions are meant to last, and there is a way in which clauses are drafted so that they endure for longer periods of time. But sometime in the life of a nation, it might become necessary to introduce change through the Constitution, because it has become necessary. And if you think change is necessary, you advocate for it. You advocate for it with people who are able to influence not only the idea of constitutional change, but also the fact of constitutional change. You start by engaging people like Fazia. You know, if you can convince Fazia, for example, that legislatures must seriously consider change because it's necessary, then you have started your first attempt to succeed. But you will have to convince those who can influence the course of change, of constitutional change, that the change is necessary, I would say. You remember how the engagements and the debates around Section 25 of the Constitution had started and ended. And similarly, constitutional debates may be started by advocacy along the lines. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mama Khoro, can I get any other input from the panelists? If I could get
Yes, Chairperson, I've been trying to turn on my video, but
oh, great. And then I see Fatiha also has, after you, I will go to Fasiha. Go ahead.
I'm back. Hi. I wanted to respond to Nhlanhla Nkobi's question about the people shall govern. And I also want to pick up from Justice Mokhoro's intervention. Because I think one of the biggest misnomers by mischievous politicians in this country is the notion that the Constitution is sacrosanct, that it cannot be amended, that it is some kind of holy biblical document that is untouchable. The truth is that the Constitution belongs to the people because it was drafted by the people's representatives. It was ratified by the people's representatives in Parliament, and it has been amended 17 times. I was in the National Assembly during Constitution 17th, which was the amendment that made the Constitutional Court the apex court in South Africa. So Parliament has plenty of opportunity and enormous powers to amend the Constitution. And the point about Parliament is that it is an institution that is supposed to represent the people. I think there's two things happening here. The first is that you have mischievous politicians, and I'm going to include the former president in this number because you mentioned him, Nhlanhla, and because I've had many run-ins with him. You have mischievous politicians who want to convince people that the Constitution is some kind of block on economic progress, economic transformation, social transformation, equality, etc. They want to imply that the Constitution is a document that was drafted with lofty goals that are not as important as bread and salt and water, which is fundamentally untrue. I mean, I mentioned in my intervention the areas of the Constitution that specifically talk about bread and salt and water, and housing, and environment, and education, and so forth. It is a document drafted by our representatives for our people, and it is amended on a regular basis, as I said the last time in 2012. The Constitution has different rules for different parts of the document. So some parts of the document require 2/3 of the House to amend, and some require different ratios, again, depending on the weight of their importance. And the most difficult to amend is the Bill of Rights. But I want to assure you that there is a committee in Parliament that accepts suggestions for amendments to the Constitution. It processes them regularly, and often they make it to the floor of Parliament. There's currently a committee that is considering the issue of property rights in the Constitution. There are ample opportunities for our people to contribute to and be part of keeping the Constitution as a living document that reflects who we are as a people. But the key is that it has to be a high bar. You need to have a very high number, not just a simple majority of members of Parliament amending the Constitution, precisely because it's the foundational law of our country. Every other law in South Africa flows from the Constitution. So we've agreed on certain principles, and now using those principles, we draft legislation that speaks to those principles and gives life to them. So one last thing I want to say about the amendments to the Constitution, and I'm sorry to use the United States as an example again, it's quite an easy example. The United States Constitution is 233 years old. It has only been amended 27 times. Our Constitution is 25 years old, a 10th of that age, and we've amended it 17 times. So just comparatively, our Constitution is far more alive, flexible, and available for amendment than, for example, a country like the United States, which still is only on 27 after 233 years. That's on average, if I'm getting my maths right, one amendment every decade. So I really want to emphasize that we mustn't fall for the tricks of politicians who want to create the Constitution as some kind of oppositional or problematic document that prevents the transformation of our society. It is actually the document that enables it. The last point I want to make, Chair, is that I'm really, really happy that Minister Aaron Motsoaledi and his committee are working on the issue of electoral reform. I think as a country, we have a lot to thank the New Nation movement for, because theirs was a public interest litigation that took the principle of independence running for office to the Constitutional Court. And what that's going to result in, it's the only way independents can be elected to Parliament, is constituency system elections, direct elections. And the reason I reference electoral reform is that I think when I talk about Parliament being the people's parliament, because political parties are kind of like a barrier between the people and the legislature, people don't feel like the people in the legislature represent them. They don't know all their names. They don't know where they come from. They don't know what they stand for. And I think as citizens, we're going to feel a lot more ownership over Parliament if we are put in a position where the country is divided into a series of constituencies, and Lindiwe runs against Fazia, runs against Bonang, and in my district, those candidates canvass me as a voter, tell me as a voter what they're going to do in my community. And of course, with direct election comes the ability to petition for the removal of an MP. So if an MP is not performing, their voters should be able to remove them from Parliament. That direct connection between the people and their representatives in Cape Town is, I think, going to enable people to have a far more lively relationship with Parliament than they do right now, where Parliament is an institution that's largely controlled by political parties, and political parties act almost as a barrier between the people in the electorate and those who serve them in Parliament. So I want you to rest assured that the Constitution belongs to us all as citizens. We all have a right to motivate for changes to it. And hopefully with the amendment of the electoral laws, we will start to see a democracy in which the members of Parliament are seen as representatives, true representatives of the people, rather than anonymous characters that were nominated by committees that we never see deliberating. Thanks very much, Chair.
Thank you very much. Fazia, when you come in, can you also deal with the thing from Dimasha Kung, who says the young people are not ready to rule this country. They themselves don't understand their own lives as it is. Totally disagree with you. So can you, as you respond, if you can please also deal with that.
Thanks, Silo. I'm just unable to start my video. I think there we go. There we go. Thanks. Now let me start with that question, then I'll give my little input on one other one. So this idea that young people are not ready to lead, that we don't understand our own lives, it's an interesting one, right? And I want to challenge these notions very particularly. First, the idea that we as young people don't know what we want or that we don't understand things, and second, that we're not ready. I think it's extremely condescending, and I also think it's regressive. It assumes that we don't have agency. It assumes that we don't have the ability to decide our own fate or our own destiny. And it's exactly the kind of thinking that has put us in the current crisis that we are in the first place. And I want to cite one or two examples in answering this question in a more holistic way. The first is that when we led Fees Must Fall as young people, there were many naysayers who said the same things to us. They also said that we'd never succeed, that it was a pipe dream, that we don't know what we're doing, that we don't understand things, etc., etc. And we did, not to blow our own horns, but I think it's important to understand the greater context of what I'm trying to say. We did in 2 years what everybody else failed to do in 20. And we did that because we did things differently. Imagine we had listened to the naysayers. Imagine we had listened to these ideas that we're too young to lead, or that we don't know what we're doing, or that we're not ready. Imagine we had done that. There would be no push for free education. There would be no changes in higher education around the post-colonial element. We wouldn't have forced this issue onto the dinner tables of every single South African. Imagine if we expected that notion that it should continue on in the same way. And that's the point that I want to make about young people, right? That if we continue doing the things in the same way that we already have, we're never going to change the status quo. And that's quite clear, right? I'm 27 years old. We've had democracy for 27 years. If we continue doing things in the same way, we're going to continue 27 years from now to see the same thing. And so that what shows us is just how important young people and that fresh thinking and that innovative thinking needs to be. We need to change ideas. And yes, we belong to a millennial generation. Everybody says, you know, to insult us that we have this instant gratification issue, that we're waiting for handouts, that we're impatient. But the reality is that impatience and that fire is the best thing about us, because it means that we don't accept things the way we are. We refuse to, actually. We ask the difficult questions. And more importantly, we ask questions of why. Why are we doing things in this particular way when we could in reality be doing it in a different way? And those difficult questions are what's caused change. And that's also what I think is going to help in changing how young people view the state and how young people view South African society, because we're able to show that you don't have to go steps 1, 2, and 3. We can go steps 1, 2, and then 7, and we're able to get to the conclusion much faster. So I know it's a difficult thing. I know that we live in a society, especially in South Africa, which is very ageist in its nature, but I want us to completely debunk that, because the only way we're going to change this, the only way we're going to fully fundamentally implement the Constitution in a progressive way is through an intergenerational element. So I'm not saying we have all the experience in the world. I'm saying that we have a different lived experience and a different way of thinking. And that is exactly what's important about us. I also want to bring in a little thing. I think it was Nhlanhla who might have asked this around the parliamentary element. And I just want to add on to what Sis Lindiwe was saying. You know, the danger of parliamentary sovereignty was seen during apartheid, right? There was absolutely no accountability, there was no scrutiny, no safety nets that this particular constitutional democracy gives us. It is still safer and more progressive because it only interferes when there are things that are contradictory to the Constitution, that are against the Bill of Rights, that are discriminatory, that are racist, etc., etc. It's not the automatic thing that the Constitution will undo the work of Parliament. In fact, it's only when there's a challenge that it's actually looked at. So the judiciary doesn't just intervene willy-nilly or as an automatic or as a default position. We still uphold the separation of powers. But imagine we didn't have this constitutional democracy. We would have had no idea what happened in those last 9 years. Even those of us who are members of the ANC who are trying to change things, we would never have known that. So we must never fall into traps of this or that, black or white. Everything is nuanced. Everything is on a spectrum. And if we understand where we come from and where we're trying to go, you then begin to see, number one, why certain arguments are made, so that people can rule with absolute power, absolute majority, without even being held accountable internally. But it also shows you about where we want to go. So no matter who is in power, no matter who is the president, no matter who's in parliament, we need systems that hold us accountable. We need systems that say, actually, Fasea, what are you doing in that portfolio committee that you sit in? And one of the things that we've been trying to do as young parliamentarians, and it's a small thing, is really, I put out all my work on my social media. We do different videos and lives before portfolio committee meetings. Hey, what do you guys think about this? Because we're trying to remove those barriers from the people to us. We're elected by the people, right? It shouldn't just be in this closed door, dark circle kind of thing. We need to be able to contact our public representatives directly and say, hey, I have this problem. How do we fix it? Or, hey, this is what my idea is. That's my favorite part about engaging. Young people are full of ideas, whether it's about land, whether it's about the use of artificial intelligence for service delivery. There's so much we can do. And I think that's what gives me hope. And that's why maybe I won't be an idealist 5 years from now, but I still am. Because there are enough people in this country who want to change things and who want to take ownership and who want to say that we're going to build something for the better. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Prof. Madonsela. Before you come in, just to note also that Mamukor, I have a colleague Alwana who says, we want to see her face. So when you respond to the next question, they want to see that you are really there and they want to see your face. Prof. Madonsela?
I just need my video to be reinstated. Okay, wonderful. Thank you, Chair. The question specifically asked of me was the question on people fought for constitutional democracy and people fought for democracy and they got constitutional democracy. That's a lie. That's just a plain lie. Who are the people? I'm part of the people. You are part of the people. The liberation movement in this country was the first to start thinking about some kind of guaranteed rights, even before the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. We get that statement of rights that the leaders such as Pixley Kaseme, etc., put together and sent to London as part of the negotiations. That was guaranteed rights. The Freedom Charter is an example of also the fact that the liberation movement wanted a set of guaranteed rights that would not be subject to the whims and wishes of any specific government. There's also a lie that has been perpetrated that says the Bill of Rights was an invention of the National Party. The ANC was overcome by the National Party in the negotiation. That also is a lie, because the ANC came with its own version of a Bill of Rights long before the negotiation started. When I spoke about that event where Feroz Kachalia led us as the VITS team, we were dealing with what the ANC had been working on in exile. So I don't know who are the people that fought for democracy. But let's also look at, if we had stayed with parliamentary supremacy, we would still not be having ARVs provided by the state, because it took constitutional democracy and the courts reviewing government action for that to happen. It took the Constitutional Court to decide that customary law should not deprive women and girls the right to inherit. And that was the Bear case. And then also the Moseneke case, the recognition of customary marriage. In fact, if the agenda for change, if transformative constitutionalism was left only to parliamentarians, it would take hundreds and hundreds of years for us to make progress. Because part of the problem is that the Constitutional Court is the only place that I found during my research on social justice where there's mainstreaming of equality in everything they do. Our parliamentarians are not doing that. They're not doing like the English Parliament, where before you pass a law, you ask yourself, what will it mean for Black people? What will it mean to poor people? What will it mean with people with disabilities? In terms of equality duty in the UK, you can't pass a law until you have answered the question of what will be the impact on protected groups. And we haven't done that. The Constitutional Court, you'll see that in Minister of Finance versus Van Heerden, where it said transformative constitutionalism to advance equality is a duty in respect of everything we do. You'll see that voice in Daniels versus Kripant. You'll even see it in the death penalty case, S versus Makwanyane, where Justice Muhoro, among us, infuse Ubuntu in how we handle things. So again, I'm not saying the courts are better than Parliament. I'm just saying that we deliberately chose a polycentric approach to democracy, where we did not package our power in one institution. The power was diffused, state power was diffused, so that when there's a gap here, another institution fills the gap. Doesn't mean that the courts are everything. It just means they filled a gap where they need to be. So it's a lie that we did not choose constitutional democracy. And again, lastly, on the same question, but going back to the issue about changing the constitution, I gave you an example of the iPhone versus Motorola. We can't change the constitution when we're using the iPhone like Motorola. And the land question is one example where we've not exhausted all possibilities, and we think that changing the constitution is going to be the magic button. So I'm not against changing the constitution, but changing the constitution because we're looking for transactional solutions as opposed to systemic change is not going to resolve our problems. And then the question about government has always ruled with lies, I think that is going to be answered by Minister Lamola, because I don't necessarily think government always lies. I have been in government, and it's much easier to throw stones when you're on the other side. I do think people do the best they can, but there are thieves among people in government that have stolen, and those thieves are now using the anger and hunger of our people to say, we worked for you, and we've been now penalized for working for you. But people are not asking, what is it that you delivered? Why have we become the most unequal society in the world? Why is unemployment growing? Why was Nkandla allowed where $250 million was used to advance the quality of life of one family in a country where some people go without food for days in 1 week? Thank you.
Sure. Thank you very much, Prof. For this round, I'd like Ndate Mohale to come in. And while you respond, can I please put a couple more things on your basket to consider? Jacqueline asks, I'd like to know how employment works for the ages of 18 to 35. So the skills training and employment that barely happen. How does that work? Tulile Kanyile says we need, but this is also for the minister. When you come in, please, shouldn't we, as we look at these difficult questions that we're dealing with today, also be looking at workshops of how we should implement some of the ideas that people like Ndate Mohale came up with, and Prof. In fact, all of you came up with some tangible ideas. Who's going to lead the discussions that can then get us to these solutions that you've put forward? The last one from Kaiser Koza that I'd like to also throw in your basket, Ndate Mohale, because I think it's very relevant to you also. We have two communities in South Africa, the haves and the have-nots, the privileged and the not so privileged. The other is resisting programs towards socio-economic justice through lawfare, Kaiser calls it. And it infuriates the poor, he says. Every legislation aimed at leveling the playing ground is challenged in courts. So this also goes to the minister when you come in, Minister. So let's go for this round, Ndate Mohale.
Ndate Hatang Kia Lebuwa. So let me start with my boss, Kaiser Koza, about the haves and the have-nots. And I will be philosophical and brief. The duration of oppression is always determined by the oppressed, never by the oppressor. So if you depend on your oppressor to feed you, they will feed you just enough to make sure that you don't thrive to an extent where you can yourself be independent. The people that were responsible for our subjugation, for our incarceration and oppression, can be the very same people who are then excited about our liberation. It's like trying to get the turkey excited about Christmas. On the employment of 18 to 35, our law says at 18 you can get married, you don't need your parents' consent. And in fact, we employ legally people from 16 years of age when they only have learner's driver's licenses because they can only have them at 18. So at 18 to 35, you've got the full rights. But I also want to support what my colleagues said, especially Fasa Hassan, in this ageism, and just remind ourselves that, you know, Maria Ramos and Geraldine Fraser-Moleketi were the youngest when they were put in Rolihlahla Nelson Mandela's cabinet. One was 28, the other was 32. Therefore, I think we are in trouble when we don't deliberately, purposefully, consciously hand over the baton to young people. And to demand experience from them is disingenuous, because nobody is born a managing director. Nobody is born knowing how to swim. You have to be put in the deep end with support, counseling, and coaching to make sure that you ultimately do. And on this piece, I think business has a big role on advancing gender equality. 27 years into democracy, it can be that women who are 51% of the population are still less than 24% of positions of leadership, especially the C-suite. African women less than 4%. Pay parity does not need a conference, a workshop. It needs one CEO to go to Shell on Monday and say, let me see how you're paying women and men for work of equal value. And that's the work that we need to do, and we haven't done that. I think Professor Thuli Madonsela is absolutely right when he says people like telling lies, especially politicians. You know, education is the surest guarantee that makes sure that you won't be lied to by politicians. That's why I think, Fazia, you need to help us to take education much more seriously, because that's the only way we can transcend social classes. For me personally, I have lots to thank young people for, especially for the hashtag everything must fall, precipitated by hashtag fees must fall. I thank young people for giving us this notion of an inclusive academic excellence today, this freedom of speech, the public ownership of institutions of higher learning. But most importantly, I thank them for giving us a social justice approach to institutions of higher learning, but also for their decolonization. How is it possible that Black people's history only starts at 1652 with the arrival of the Reiger dromedaries and the goeie hoop? It can be. So if we don't actively work side by side with young people so that they watch what we are doing, so that we can quickly hand over to, if it took me 20 years to be an MD, when I work with young people, I expect it to take them no more than 5 years. Let me conclude, Ntate, by just touching on one other issue about constitutional democracy and the lies that continue to be told. So first, I was part of the delegation, business delegation that went to see the ANC in exile. I can tell you that it was their plan. But I was also an MD of Otis Elevators when we worked with the Kennedy School of Public Governance, when we used to take on average 10 ANC members to the states so that they can learn about how to be better legislators. I did that for 5.5 years. We realized that it's too slow. We took 320 of them at Van Riebeck Hotel in the Western Cape, and we brought the entire faculty to say, let's see how we can teach them. I was part of the people who authored the Montfleur scenario, because that's Shell scenarios. That ended up in a document that is called Ready to Govern. It was Ready to Govern. That went to CODESA 1, collapsed, and then CODESA 2. All of those were ANC principles. And by the way, the 26th of June 1955 Freedom Charter in Kliptown had 10 principles. The 8th of those 10 says the doors of learning shall be opened. The 5th of that says the land shall belong to those who work it. And those are the concepts that ultimately found their ways into our modern day constitution indeed. Lastly, of course, why is it that we are not palliating, highlighting, and celebrating the people that helped to defend the malls and their own institution? You're absolutely correct. In fact, those malls that were not looted in peacetime, not in wartime, are the ones where the mall managements engaged, interacted, and interfaced with communities from respect, from kindness. And those are the communities that formed the human chain to say, you're not going to destroy our jobs, you're not going to destroy our malls. Even in the face of malls that are owned by Black people, like the one in Lesedi, that was 35-year-old with 38 Black owners. And the two malls, Jabulani Mall and Dofaya Mall, that is owned by one African who got his first service station for liquid fuels from me when I was running Shell Oil Products Africa at that time.
Minister, I would like to bring you in here and maybe add a couple things again to your basket, which already is heavy. Firstly, the heavy congratulations that you've been getting with the department for organizing this session. I need to just add on to that. And then you have Mtate Mike Steinbank, who says the South African judiciary is a cesspool of racist malfeasance initiated by a violent anti-Black ANC-led regime with non-white criminals such as Nelson Mandela and violent white racists such as George Bezos as linchpins. So I think that's something to do with the racism that Steinbank feels is there in the judiciary. And then maybe to end off for you, Minister, the issue of the Constitution is that it does not talk to majority of people who cannot afford to challenge their matters in high courts of the country and therefore resorting to violence. So that's in the last one, sorry, I keep on saying the last one. The last one is how does the Constitution, or how can it protect citizens, particularly the disadvantaged, from being exploited by leaders? So that's where I'd like to then give to the Minister, and hopefully the Minister then will draw us to towards the end before I give, time permitting, before I give each panelist 2 more minutes to close. Minister?
Thank you, Dr. Adang. You have given me a very difficult one. Maybe it could be best handled by Mayor Yvonne Bukor, but Justice. But I think our courts have interpreted the Constitution in a manner that seeks to give its values, its true meaning on many of its judgments, including the laws that we have, which includes to bring equality in society and the various laws that seek to bring justice. And I think Professor Madonsela did raise the issue with regards to ARVs, issues of housing and so forth, what the courts have done to bring equality. I don't think there is no one who can rightly accuse the courts of racism or the judiciary itself of racism. There could be issues of transformation, which is an ongoing project that all of us as society have to participate to transform the entire judicial landscape of our country. And I think that is the reason why the Judicial Service Commission is composed the way it is, with multiplicity of various stakeholders from all walks of life, Black, white, Indians, political parties, and representative of the legal profession, the judiciary participating, is the most diverse structure that I know in the current democratic institution that is aimed to choose the judges. I know of no any other most diverse structure with various stakeholders aimed to it, and that was also aimed to give meaning to the equality clause and also to the diversity of our country. The part that says that we govern with lies, I'm also not sure why Mr. Dan gave me these kind of matters, but the reality is that when we took over in 1994 as the government of this country, we were not governing. The reality is that there was trial and error. There are things that we did not know could work, that did work. There are things that we did not know that they will not work, or they will not work, but did not work. And I think the land question is the one that I want to pick. The government of the day was advised that we will be able, through a restitution program, to restitute about 30% of the land by 2004. But evidence on the ground, the implementation of the restitution program, because of it's a highly judicial process, highly complex and cumbersome, but also was besieged by corruption and other nepotism and so forth. We could not achieve that intended goal of 30%. And since then, there's been a dialogue in the country. How do we achieve the objective of equitable distribution of the land? But when we put the law into action, the Constitution and also the Restitution Act, if you look at it, it was one of amongst the first laws that the former President Mandela assented to, because it was in December 1994. So it is one of those that you will realized that there was a clear commitment to achieve land reform in this country. But experience and practice made it, it was almost an impossible task because we could not achieve that we wanted to achieve on the basis of a plethora of issues that the Mtlante Commission has since pointed out that they besieged our land reform program. But there was good meaning, there was good intention. And even when you look at the graph up until somewhere in 2007, you will see that it is going up, and there was a work to achieve the objective of land reform. But lessons have been learned. It has been shown that you cannot drive a land reform program, firstly, a market-driven land reform program. Secondly, that you cannot drive a land reform program through a restitution program. Any country in the world, it has always been run through redistribution. It has always been run for the sharing of the majority of people, because the restitution program is like even when you deal with a simple theft case in a court process, it can take between 1 to 2 years. But if then it's a land issue, it will definitely take long because some of them are very complex. Hence, many parts of the world have emphasized redistribution, where the state acquire land through whether without compensation or with a kind of a compensation, but not at market value for distribution. And across the globe, that is how many successful land reform programs have succeeded. And that is a lesson that we take in the past 25 years. And we cannot say it is lies. It's a reality of governance. The education system also, there are lessons that we have learned up until we have been woken up by the various programs that came through from student leaders and student organizations, NFSAS, the Fees Must Fall movement, have shifted government to understand that this cannot be run in a market-driven kind of a commodity when you run an education system. There must be some kind of a collaboration between the private sector, government, and everyone to achieve the goals of equal education for all. So all this, there has also been a reality of the corruption, which is now been exposed through the Zondo Commission, and in some instances, the offices of the public protector and so forth. That has shown that there's also been actions of misgovernance that led to some of the constitutional failures that we find ourselves dealing with today. But for me, what becomes important, Chairperson, is the lessons that we have learned in these 25 years. And how do we build from these lessons to build a nation that we all want and that we believe will achieve the goals as stated in those aspirational documents like the Freedom Charter, the Constitution itself, in terms of the preamble, which I believe we can still do it. And I believe that the current vaccination program is a good example of a nation working together to achieve a particular goal. Because the work that is there is between the private sector, civil society, is from academia, the professors and experts, government itself. We have all joined together as a nation to build a project that will achieve herd immunity. And in the past 2-3 months that they are done, all of us, even some in the nation, were beginning to doubt whether we will ever take off in this vaccination program. But today we have reached 7 million, and in the entire globe we're sitting at number 11, even outranking some of the world's most developed nations like Germany and others. It is because of that collaboration. And I think for our constitution, for our nation to survive, that is what we can move forward to build this nation for the benefit of all. Thanks, I hope I have answered some of the issues.
You did indeed. Thank you very much, Honorable Minister. I think I was going to give each one of you another 2 minutes, but I've learned now that none of you can take 2 minutes because you have this thing finally. Let me close. In closing, let me conclude. So before we go back to round 2 in conclusion, let me rather thank all of you. Fasiya Hassan, thank you very much again for pushing the boundaries that you've been pushing. And I'm happy that I got the book before you. So I hope that we will have a good debate pretty soon The book, for those who didn't see, is the Sizombo of Welsh's book, which Fasia says now she disagrees with his conclusion. So let's see how that goes. Oslindiwe, it's always such a pleasure to engage with you, and looking forward to many, many more engagements like today. Prof. Mohale, I can't thank you enough for always availing yourself for things like this. Prof. Madonsela, I was looking out to see if you have any marks of being on Kilimanjaro. I can attest to the fact that you took that mountain on like a pro, because I can't see any marks that says she has been on that mountain. So well done and congratulations again. And then finally to Memo Khoro, thank you very much. I see you switched on your camera, and I want to thank you for doing that, because I was getting more messages. We want to see our judge. So
this is particularly for Koleka. Koleka expressed the need. But my hand had been up for quite a while, but we'll get another opportunity to address some of these issues.
Thank you very much. Based on you saying it's been up for a while, like I didn't see it, I'll give you the last word. Let me thank the minister before I hand over to you. Let me thank the minister for pulling us together. You know, Minister Lamola, you and I have had those interactions where we say, you know, we needed to have better governance. And I'm glad that you are now at the helm of justice and you're trying to move the boundaries as best you can. So let me give Memo Khoro, before I hand over to Advocate Mashabane, my good friend, to then close this session, to officially then see us off. Justice.
Yes. I first of all wanted to agree with Professor Madonsela about the fact that courts are no better than any other arm of government. You don't have to go to court first before you enforce your constitutional rights. The Constitution obligates all three arms of the state to respect and protect the Constitution. Parliament must pass laws to pursue the constitutional project, as I said in my address. Government must create instruments to do the same. It is only when those obligations are not met that constitutional complaints may be brought before the courts. And besides, the courts do not by themselves raise issues. Constitutional complaints are brought by the public or parties who have been aggrieved before the courts. And it is only then that courts will order constitutional compliance. It is never cost effective to go to court when issues can be resolved by government or the executives. And the executives will have to have programs to policies to pursue constitutional or social justice or the constitutional imperatives. So the Constitution obligates all three arms of government to pursue and protect constitutional rights. And then the question of racism in the courts through the interpretation. Courts interpret the Constitution, legislation, through interpretive tools, legal interpretive tools. And they hear matters in open court. They reason their judgments. In other words, they interpret their judgments transparently, openly, and their judgments are published for full scrutiny by the public and by their peers. Court decisions may be appealed, and if you end up in the last resort, court of last resort, and there are any particular complaints of racism, the Judicial Services Commission is there, as the Minister has indicated. And if you take a complaint about the conduct of particular judges or a particular judge to the Judicial Services Commission, you have a forum there constituted by a cross-section of views, and your complaint will be justifiably determined by the Judicial Services Commission. So if any racism accusations based on fact arise, the Judicial Services Commission is there to determine the conduct of judges. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ntate Mashabane, before you come in, just to thank the team, your team there. They've been incredible in getting us all going. Sia and Ntate Sibia, thank you very much. Mari and Abongile, thank you so much. And of course, there's a whole lot of other people. But Ntate Mashabane.
Program Director, thank you very much, and we want to appreciate you as well for the manner in which you steered this program. We are right on time. We're scheduled to finish at 12:15, so I'll use the next 2 minutes so that we finish 1 minute before 12:15. And I want to take this opportunity on behalf of the department and indeed the Minister to thank you and all the panelists for having made the time to join us in this webinar, which is meant to be a launch of a program for the 25th anniversary of the Constitution and to mobilize the whole of society into a dialogue. And indeed, we couldn't have, convened the best of South African brain, to have this discussion. And I think we've proven again that as South Africans, we are not short of ideas, and we're not short of understanding what our challenges are. So we're grateful and we're very humbled as a department that we had this opportunity. I will at least make a commitment that for all the ideas that were brought here, there was a question about what's going to happen to all these ideas, that we'll follow through on each one of them. We will go to Stellenbosch, to Professor Madonsela, to specifically go into details and discuss about the role of academia and intelligentsia generally in our society. The same we'll do as well with civil society, with Seslindiwe and a broader part of civil society as well, and see how all of us have a discussion about the 25th anniversary and look back and reflect on the past 25 years and how we can improve our constitution going forward. And I think the minister did make the point that at 50 years anniversary of the constitution, we shouldn't be dealing with the same challenges, particularly the issues around social justice. And I'm quite confident that many of the people in this platform, when the constitution turns 50, which will be half a century, will still be available and will remember this discussion that we have had. And want to thank you, Justice Memoforo, specifically for having agreed as well, even on a short notice, to come and be our keynote address. Even when you are in your retirement, you continue to serve our constitutional democracy. I've taken note of the concerns you have raised with Chris, and we'll do all we can to address some of those to make sure that you continue to serve our nation. And Faiza as well, I think you will help us a lot in mobilizing the youth to have a discussion, because indeed this constitution is not for the old guards. They have laid the foundation, they were the pathfinders, but we have to talk about the future of our constitutional democracy. We have to think about ourselves, the future generation and posterity, and it will be upon our shoulders. And we'll have to account at some points as what we'll have done to make sure that our constitutional state remains intact and we continue to build and strengthen on it. Prof. Madonsela mentioned the Chapter 5 of Pepuda. The challenges still abide, and but under the leadership of the minister, we'll continue and we'll do our best to make sure that it doesn't just continue, to remain unoperationalized, and make sure that we bring every part of society to ensure that that act in its totality is implemented. Prof. Bonang Mohale will be happy to partner with you as well, and the entirety of business and private sector, and have this discussion as well. And going forward beyond the 25th anniversary, and look into the future and say what kind of a South Africa we want to see in the next 25 years. Can this constitution continue to carry us? And if it's any amendments, what do we do to make sure that those amendments are not taking us back, but they continue to make it the best that we can have in the world? But all in all, I want to thank the panelists for the time, and want to appreciate the leadership of the minister, continues to avail himself to be part of the thought leaders in this nation. And I will commit him and myself to join you, Dade Hatang, to Kilimanjaro to go and plant the 25th anniversary flag at the Mount Kilimanjaro. So you must remind us in your next visit to Kilimanjaro that you take me and the minister as well in celebration of the 25th anniversary of the Constitution. I thank you.
Thank you very much. Have a good day.